particularly during the fight against ISIS and what was then officially called Operation Inherent Resolve. Ever since the sick bastards started cutting those hostages' heads off, my guys and I had been itching to take a shot at them. But we had to wait about a year and a half to get that chance, and by then, the good guys were already starting to put the squeeze on them. ISIS was no longer threatening Baghdad, and a combination of Kurdish Peshmerga and Arab militias were slowly forcing them back towards their regional capital, Mosul. The Caliphate's downfall was well underway, but their fanatical fighters still posed a serious threat to Iraq's people and the country's heritage. A lot of the time, that heritage came in the form of ancient places of worship, be they Christian, Jewish, or from even older religions like Zoroastrianism. And you gotta remember that Baghdad is only 30 miles from the ruins of ancient Babylon, and that the country's modern name comes from the Sumerian city of Uruk, which was founded 7,000 years ago. All that history means a lot of their old ruins are listed as World Heritage Sites. Then, since ISIS made a hobby out of blowing that stuff up, Command declared that any attempts to vandalize UNESCO-designated sites, and we had the green light to go after them. And so when intel came in that a platoon-sized element of ISIS fighters was headed out into the desert, after checking a prisoner out of their Mosul jail, our collective spidey senses started tingling. There was a chance that they were about to shoot an execution video, in which case we were good to go on that too. But this was summer 2016, not summer 2014. Cutting just one person's head off wasn't shocking enough to get the whole world's attention anymore, so a telltale sign that they were about to shoot one of their snuff movies would be seeing 15 to 20 guys in orange jumpsuits, not just one. Ourselves and the Iraqis had tons of informants all over Mosul, some within the ISIS organization itself, so it was only a matter of time before we found out which prisoners their fighters were escorting. She was an Arab Christian woman named Miriam, who just so happened to be on the staff of the Mosul History Museum. Once we got direct confirmation that the fighters were headed to an Iraqi heritage site, it was go time, and then after loading up around dusk, we got airborne as quickly as possible. The flight took around 30 minutes, and in our two MHXs, or Stealth Hawks as you might know them, we were able to land within just a half a mile, confident that the enemy had no idea what was about to hit them. Now once we were touching dirt, we moved through a shallow, dry gulch until we were within maybe 200 meters, close enough to see at least 7 or 8 flatbeds parked outside the mouth of the cave. The sun sets fast in that part of the world, meaning it was almost full dark by then, and since we were headed into what looked like some kind of cave system, we pulled down our NVGs and then pushed towards its mouth. The first thing we were looking for were any sentries, but since a lot of ISIS guys weren't anything approaching professional soldiers, it didn't raise any red flags to see that they hadn't posted any. We kept on pushing forward, covering each other as we moved, and then by the time we got to the mouth of the cave, we could all smell it. It might sound like a tired cliche at this point, but blood really does have a strong coppery smell to it when it's in high enough quantities. And on those warm desert evenings, when the cold's yet to set in, you can smell that metallic stink from a long way off if the air's still and enough of it's been spilled. And in the first and largest chamber we entered, God help us, there was a lot of blood. The walls of the tunnel at the cave's entrance had been sanded smooth, possibly thousands of years before, but the inscriptions chiseled into them by long-dead hands had survived. They were incredible to witness, and for a few moments I found it truly humbling to be in the presence of something so ancient. But what lay in the center of that first chamber made me sick to my stomach. Miriam, the ISIS prisoner and former employee of the Mosul History Museum, was dead, and she appeared to have been tortured. Her hands and feet showed signs of having been stabbed repeatedly. Her shirt had been pulled up to show that she'd been gutted via a deep wound to her side, but the cause of death appeared to be partial decapitation, something which had left a huge puddle of blood to settle and thicken on that stony ground. Someone had tried to make a spectacle of her death, clearly for the benefit of a nearby camera, but neither the executioner nor the cameraman nor any of the other ISIS fighters were anywhere to be seen. Not stationing a sentry outside was one thing, but there we were, standing right in the middle of their set, and no one had so much as given us a mean look, let alone shot at us. We figured that they were hiding down the tunnels that we could see to our left and right, but again, ISIS weren't the hiding type, so what the hell was keeping them so quiet? We split into 2 teams of 3 and then advanced down either tunnel. We expected an ambush, and the worst-case scenario of being trapped in there was a very real possibility. But within maybe a minute or two, we reached an empty chamber at the end of the tunnel, and then got the all-clear from our buddies in the other tunnel as well. Only their chambers weren't empty, and I remember hearing one of them over the radio saying, "Y'all better come see this. We just found our guys." And found them. They definitely did. Because after linking up with our teammates in the other chamber, we found what must have been 20 to 25 ISIS guys, and not a single one of them was breathing. They were all spread out around the edge of the cave. A lot of them were in the fetal position, but a couple looked like they tried to burrow their way through the rock while tearing off their own fingernails in the process. That was the only time we found hot brass, as in found a place that the ISIS guys had fired their weapons. But from what we could tell, they'd either been shooting at each other, very unlikely, or they'd been shooting at someone in the center of the room in such a panicked fashion that either it hadn't occurred that they might have hit friendlies, or it seemed worth it to neutralize the threat. If that had been the case, whoever got them certainly didn't stick around until we showed up. But they did leave something behind, in the form of the damage inflicted to each ISIS fighter. And in all my life, military or not, I've never seen wounds like it. Apart from tearing off their fingernails or the occasional bullet wound from friendly fire, the fighters' limbs or torsos had next to no damage to them. But their skulls looked like they'd been shoved headfirst into pizza ovens for 8 hours apiece. I'm not kidding. They weren't just burned. They were scorched, with bones so blackened that it looked almost glassy in places. But I swear to God, from the neck down, most didn't even have so much as a single scratch on them. All 6 of us just stopped and stared at these bodies for a few seconds, all in total silence, all just letting it process, I guess. The air smelled like bad barbecue too, no word of a lie, and it was that stink of burned meat that got someone to break the silence. Not a single one of us had any idea what might inflict that kind of damage, and while we didn't particularly want to stick around to find out, there were no obvious threats anywhere in the cave system. The only thing left was to call in what we'd found, set up a perimeter outside, and wait for the Kurds to show up to lock the place down and take away the bodies. I didn't get much of a look at the inscriptions on the walls on my way out. I was too busy looking at the bodies than down my rifle sights as we made our way outside. We then had to wait a couple of hours, but the Kurds showed up all right, and as our team leader completed his handover with the guy leading them, I got talking to one of their dudes. He had to be like 50 years old because he told me he fought Saddam back in the 90s after that piece of crap started gassing them in their homes. We talked back and forth for a while, and his English was pretty good, and so I took the opportunity to ask him what exactly was in that cave. The old Kurd knew the area well, and told me it was a shrine to Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love, who was later called Ishtar by the Babylonians. That meant it was literally thousands of years old, and there it was out there in the desert, completely unguarded, just there. We took some pictures of the bodies, which, as you can imagine, our intelligence guys were very interested in, and then after we flew back to base, debriefed and showered, it all became just another war story. See, all those burned skulls isn't even close to the weirdest story that I got from my time in the SEALs. Heck, it's not even the weirdest thing I saw in Iraq. If the cops came across that same scene back stateside, it'd be all over the news. But in Iraq, with ISIS running around chopping off heads and setting folks on fire, finding those bodies was just Tuesday, you know? I thought about it a lot after, and we talked about it amongst ourselves, but the only explanation was that someone just got to them before we did, Someone who managed to burn all their skulls and fast too before scooting so quick that we didn't even see them from the choppers coming in. What and why weren't our business, and so we tried not to speculate too hard. And then a week later, it was on to the next thing, and then the next, and then the next, until Mosul was liberated and we could all go home. But years later, after I'd left the military, I went down a little rabbit hole reading about Inanna, and found out that she wasn't just the goddess of love. She was the goddess of a whole bunch of other stuff too, as those old pagan deities tended to be. Inanna was the goddess of fertility and political power, things that sort of line up with the whole love thing, as long, of course, as that political power is wielded benevolently. But Inanna was also the goddess of war, justice, and most pertinently, divine retribution. In the myth of Inanna and Shukalatura, after she's violated by a man who catches her while sleeping, Inanna unleashes a series of catastrophic plagues on the land. She turned the water in wells into blood and sent violent storms across Sumeria to drive her attacker out of hiding. When she finally found him, she killed him, securing her place in Sumerian folklore as, and this might be putting it clumsily, the goddess of revenge. This meant those ISIS guys had dragged off a prisoner to a shrine revering an ancient goddess of revenge, and then somehow after torturing and killing their prisoner, they ended up fleeing in terror from something that burned their goddamned skulls to a crisp. Honestly, I'd rather hear it from you. I'd rather know what the hell you think happened in that cave that night, because personally I can't say any of what I'm thinking out loud without feeling like I need a week in a psych ward. Even the other guys said things like, "Not my clowns, not my circus," which is probably best translated to, "Don't think about it, or it'll drive you nuts." But sometimes, it's impossible not to. My father passed away some months ago and left behind an unsent letter. He lived in his native Russia until he was 29. Now please don't be confused, I am French, so I've taken the time to translate it from Russian into English, and I've done this because although I've read it several times already, I cannot decide what to think about it. And perhaps you and your viewers can shed some light on it for me, beyond what I already know, and tell me if these are just the ramblings of an old drunk or an unheeded warning. November 19th, 2015. My dearest Vika, I'm writing to you from Marseille in France, in an apartment with a view from the old port. It reminds me of home and of you, and while there is good wine here, tonight I am in need of something stronger. You once asked me why I never write about the Navy in my letters. I avoided answering your question, and for that I am sorry, but you must understand that I do not talk about it here either, in my new life. Once or twice I have mentioned the collapse in 1991 and the chaos that followed, but I fled much earlier, and not simply for a better life, but to preserve the one that I had and still have. And so now, because we are old, I shall answer your questions so that you might understand. I was no mere sailor, my little son. I was a submariner, the pride of the Soviet Navy, and in 1988, I had the honor to serve on a Victor III, K-324 to be exact. We were sent on what was called a routine training mission in the Barents Sea, up near the Arctic Circle, to practice ice-breaking, diving tests, that kind of thing. Our captain was Comrade Kirichenko, a good man with steel in his heart, and he ensured that we carried out our orders: stay submerged, avoid detection, practice firing drills. I was the senior sonar operator then, but you must understand, this is not the same as radar. Underwater we mostly listened, ears peeled for the sound of our American counterparts, but sometimes we used the sonar itself, sending out acoustic pulses to determine the size and range of other objects in the water. That night we were deep, and for hours and hours I did nothing but listen. The Arctic waters sometimes played tricks, but then I saw something, and right away I could tell it was different. It started as a shadow on the display, and then it returned so massive the computer couldn't process it at first. I thought the array was damaged, so I recalibrated. But still, the reading was there. Gigantic, like nothing I had ever seen before. It was stationary at first, this great mass under the ice shelf, maybe, but the size, Vika, my God, it was like a mountain before us. I tried to keep calm as I called the captain. He rushed to the compartment, and when he looked at the screen, he turned pale. The whole watch gathered, and I saw them terrified. These were men who hunted Americans, who laughed at ice cracking and scoffed at crushed depth warnings. Religion was frowned upon back then, but one young lieutenant openly crossed himself. The thing we were sailing toward was like a colossus, impossibly big, not a sub, not a whale, but something else. We stayed there, listening for what must have been 10 minutes or more. There was no propulsion sound, no cavitation of any kind, just this great unexplainable presence. And then, it moved. The great mass shifted, causing the display to light up with new returns. We still had no idea what we were looking at and could be sure of only its size. And then suddenly, the passive array picked up a low-frequency rumble, one that vibrated through the hall as it passed over and through us. It sounded deep, so deep I felt it in my bones, and then as it passed, the men muttered. Captain Kirichenko ordered us full astern and had us ascend as quickly and quietly as possible. In other words, we ran. Not like proud Soviet sailors, but like children, from shadows in the dark. Whatever was in the water with us that night did not pursue us, thank God. But for hours after, every creak of the hull had us sweating. I heard our political officer Granat whispering in the control room about the importance of the mission. The captain looked like he wanted to shoot him. I'd never seen him so angry before. When we returned to port, we were quarantined, and then some naval intelligence officers came around to ask us all the same questions over and over again. And then when the questions were finished, 2 men in civilian clothing came to see us, and one by one, they sewed our lips shut. We all signed statements denying the encounter and the existence of any anomalies, as they called them. Breaking the agreement meant Kolyma prison, or even someplace worse. For years I said nothing, even to my wife. I tried to forget, but the dreams wouldn't let me, and in my dreams, I'd be down there alone in the cold and the dark, alone with a thing that wasn't Russian or American, but older than words, older than time. You remember the Kursk, don't you, in 2000? We remember, but the youth do not. They said it was a torpedo accident, leaking fuel, but I recognized the coordinates they gave and how they were less than a day's travel from the exact spot we found the blip. Same depth, same ice edge, everything. Now, I was in Paris by then, no doubt watched by KGB agents or FSB or whatever they're calling themselves these days. And as I sat in my little apartment watching the news on the TV, I remember my hand shaking as I poured myself a drink. They said the Kursk sank after an explosion in the forward compartment, but I knew the men who served with me would be thinking the same thing as I. Some said the rescue efforts were blocked by Putin himself. Others talked of strange readings on the surface ships. One old comrade, who since escaped the submarines, told me they found pieces of the Kursk hull bent outward, like something had grabbed it from below. I left Russia soon after, and France was far enough. The sea here is warm, blue, no ice, but sometimes at night when the mist comes in from the Mediterranean, I still hear that low rumble in my head. And you must think I'm a crazy old man telling these ghost stories, but I was there, and so were 20 other men. All heard it or saw how big it was on the screens, and when it moved, it was like an entire city shifted below us. Something that size would make short work of even the largest submarine, and perhaps not even through hunger, but by mere accident of its size. And I've read once, after the internet came along, about old sailor tales from the Arctic. Many echoed the legends of the Pomors, the old Russians, when they spoke of gigantic sea beasts, things which slept under the ice for generations at a time. The Soviets laughed at such things. Science, they said, would open the way from the Earth to the stars. But science does not explain a return that big with no engine noise. Science does not make trained men piss their pants or vomit in the passageway outside the sonar compartment. My little son, I'm old now, and the doctors say my heart and liver are bad. I should be thinking of happier times while I still have the breath in my lungs, but instead, I keep thinking about those boys on the Kursk. They were good men, doing their training mission like we did. Did they see the blip first? Did their sonar man try to warn them before the lights went out? These are the things I wonder late at night before I reach for a bottle. I keep a map, an old naval chart. I mark the spot with a red pen, and when I cannot sleep, I look at the map. They say the Arctic is melting now and that the ice is retreating. Blech, enough. My bottle is empty. Maybe I should not have told you, but you asked why I left, why I never came back, and why I use a different name, and now, you know. And I shall grab another bottle because tonight, I do not want to dream. In a quiet Texas town, Aaron Caffey seemed to be living an ordinary teenage life, but behind closed doors, growing tensions and hidden influences were quietly reshaping everything around her. When the silence finally broke, it left behind a case that challenged assumptions about family, trust, and just how quickly an ordinary life can descend into something unimaginable. Listen to the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. I was going to start this by telling you my name, but I guess names don't really matter. They sure as hell didn't in SOG, and we never really used our real names much anyways. Officially speaking, SOG was the most classified special operations unit of the Vietnam War. We operated under the cover of being a studies and observations group, but you learn fast that observation meant cutting someone's throat before they could alert their friends. We ran Black Ops into Laos, Cambodia, and even North Vietnam itself. They were the kind of cross-border missions that Washington would never officially admit to, meaning if we were captured as mercenaries, and no one was coming to save us. Most people back home never heard of us. No medals, no glory, just survival. Mission by mission survival. And what follows is what happened on one of those missions over the border in Laos. We were inserted by either chopper or PTF boat in small teams, usually 3 Americans and a handful of Montagnard strikers. And then after long, exhausting marches through the jungle, we'd gather intelligence, sabotage supply lines, or snatch prisoners, or in the case of this story right here, try to bring back downed pilots before the enemy could get them north and make them disappear forever. Our chopper flared low over the jungle at around 0230. I was jammed in the door with the rest of the RT Viper. Me, Cowboy, Boston, and 4 Montagnard scouts. We fast-roped into a small hole in the jungle, boots hitting mud that smelled of rot and cordite from bombs that overshot Uncle Ho's trail. The Montagnards moved like ghosts, and they hated the communists more than we did, and they were better than any American at moving through the jungle. And the mission was simple. Recon a suspected NVA way station rumored to hold a downed American pilot, and if the opportunity presented itself, bring him home. Intel said Chinese advisors had been seen moving heavy equipment onto the site, something beyond the usual anti-air missiles, and so a closer look at whatever that was would be considered a bonus. We humped for 6 hours, avoided trails, and then setting up a cold camp a few miles from the way station. By first light, we were in position on a ridgeline overlooking the objective. It didn't look like much from the outside, just another camouflage NVA logistics camp with bamboo huts, fuel drums, and a few guards with AKs. But deeper in, under netting and cut branches, we saw the concrete bunker. It looked too fresh, too permanent for Laos. Cowboy, our team leader, glassed it with his binos for a few minutes and then said that that was our target. Whatever was in there, pilot or not, we were bringing it home. After sneaking back in the camp, we ate cold LRRP rations and checked over our CAR-15s and suppressed pistols before taking turns catching some shut-eye. And then once the sun was down, it was time to work. The plan was one we'd thought of a while back, but never had the guts to try. 2 Montagnards in captured NVA uniforms would approach with a bound and hooded prisoner, and they'd explained that they picked up a prisoner and needed a place to put him, and then once they were nice and close, they could take out high-value targets without anyone realizing what was happening. Now, the rest of the team could then sweep in and support the forward guys as they grabbed whatever or whoever needed grabbing before we all got out of there in one piece. Walking towards the enemy with nothing but a cloth sack over my head and a knife in my boot was one of the most asshole-puckering things I ever did over there. But luckily, our scouts knew enough Viet to sell the story to their sentries, and it worked like a charm. Inside the perimeter, all I could hear were diesel generators humming as we walked, and then after hearing the sound of that bunker opening, I was shoved into a dimly lit corridor. Further down, another door opened, and that's when the smell hit me, like antiseptic and burnt plastic, mixed with something metallic. Now, the Montagnards started to untie me in a side room, and then, on the count of 3, out came the knives and surprised pistols, and we dropped the 2 guards with us before they even realized what was happening. Now, one of the Nars went out to signal Cowboy, Boston, and the rest of the team, and then a minute later, we were all inside. We knew we only owned that bunker for maybe 10 minutes, so we moved room to room, grabbing what we could. Charts on the walls, electrode placements, files with Chinese characters I couldn't read. One room had jars but nothing in them, but then we found the operating theater. Surgical lamps buzzed over a steel table, and on it, Jesus God. He was strapped down, buck naked, body intact, but his head was... it was open. The left side of his skull had been sawed away with a flap of bone removed and set aside. What remained of his brain looked shiny under the lights. All that gray-pink tissue was exposed, but maybe a third of it looked cut away. In its place, there was this mess of fine silver wires and a small black device about the size of a pack of cigarettes. It looked screwed into what was left of the right hemisphere. Tubes right into his nostrils, and a heavy rubber breathing mask covered his mouth and nose. The man's dog tags lay nearby, and it was the missing phantom pilot that we'd been looking for. His eyes were open, but empty. Kind of milky and confused with no recognition, just wet meat and a ruined case of bone. I'd seen men burned by napalm, shredded by claymores, even impaled alive on bamboo booby traps. But this was different. The Chi-Coms had turned him into a goddamn prototype of something that was never meant to be. Wires trailed from the device to a console, and something was flickering on it. Weak brain activity, maybe. I wanted to believe that there was a flash of something in those eyes when I leaned close, some sort of recognition that he knew that we'd come for him. But there was nothing, just the wet click of the respirator and this faint electrical hum from all the junk he was hooked up to. The Montagnards were muttering prayers to themselves, and we decided to get him out or die trying. I cut the straps, and then the pilot's body twitched as I started disconnecting the leads. Blood and clear fluid leaked from the open skull as I worked, and then when the last wire came free with a wet pop, his body arched violently and then went limp. He was gone. By the looks of things, whoever he was had long since died on that table. We wrapped the body in a poncho liner, grabbing the small black device as we did. It felt warm, alive almost, but there was no time to focus on it. We knew exfil would be tough, but it turned into a running gunfight. Once they figured out who exactly was booking it from their way station, the NVA pursued us through the jungle. One of the Nars took a round through the shoulder but kept moving. It was that or die. We dragged the pilot's body for about 2 clicks to the LZ, trading fire the whole way. And then once we were in position, a Cobra lit up the tree line behind us as the evac choppers came in hot. I sat beside the poncho-wrapped shape on the chopper ride back. Some of the wires were sticking out of the poncho, and I remembered the way that they moved in the wind. But I wasn't in the chopper. Not really. I was still back in that bunker, seeing the half-skull under the surgical lights in the pilot's empty eyes. What the hell had they been trying to build? Some remote-controlled soldier? Now that thought makes my skin crawl, even all these years later. After landing in a forward strip, the debrief was brutal. The S2 spooks took the device away in a sealed case, like it was worth its weight in gold. That night in the hooch, I drank, and the other guys didn't talk about it, but that suited me fine. Some things you just carry in silence. They told the pilot's family he died in combat, made it out to be heroic. It was obviously a lie, but I guess that's mercy of a sort. Sometimes I wonder if that black box is just sitting in some lab and if the whitecoats have unlocked its secrets yet or are still trying. I hope not, because if you saw what I saw, you'd know that man ought not to play God. My name's Jane, and I work at the National Archives here in the UK. Now, we're home to the largest collection of First World War diaries in the world, and since 2018, the 100th anniversary of the war's end, we've been busy digitizing the archives and ensuring the soldiers' words outlive the materials they were written on. However, while working with diaries from the 1916 Arras vimisector, my team uncovered a particularly striking personal account belonging to a Lance Corporal Edward Wilson of the Royal Fusiliers. And to say his account is striking would be quite the understatement. On a personal level, and having read thousands of harrowing accounts, Wilson's diary stands out as one of the most visceral and disturbing I've ever come across. It also includes testimony that has puzzled historians ever since, and while being of great interest to your audience, I believe you can present it in a fashion which pays tribute to the memories of the fallen rather than exploit them. And so with that in mind, may I present a transcribed selection of his entries, delicately edited for the purposes of clarity and legibility, which offer an unflinching glimpse into the horrors of the Western Front. Yours sincerely, Jane Gillespie. 12th October 1916. They've got us in Gangrene Alley, not far from Albert. All we do is wait, and I hate waiting. The guns keep firing and men complain, but I prefer it to the quiet. Jerry's been acting right strange for a week now. We hear them at night, but it doesn't sound like the usual sentries or work parties. Sergeant Lowe said that they might be mining, but I've been on the listening post twice now this week, and sometimes it sounds like they're arguing amongst themselves. The lads are jumpy, rumors of a big push coming. I keep my head down and try to keep my spirits up, but my feet are just about rotten from all the damp. 15th October 1916. It rained all day again. Gangrene Alley is almost shin deep. Jerry was making noise last night, so we set up a flare about 2 in the morning and caught movement in the forward trench. They were running back and forth shouting, possibly in preparation for a dawn attack, so our artillery put a few rounds over just in case. Usually they answer with their own guns quickly enough, but this time there was no reply. Very strange. 18th October 1916. Quiet day. No one likes the quiet ones. They mean something's about to happen, and Jerry's quite clearly up to something. Their line looked half abandoned at dawn, sandbags shifted, wire uncut in places. We think they're pulling back for a counterattack someplace else, but we can't be sure. On last night's patrol, one of the younger lads said that he saw a rat the size of a terrier skittering off towards German lines. We see more than the odd rat, but they're not that big. The lads laughed at him and said it was his mind playing tricks, but to me, he doesn't seem the type to tell tall tales. 20th October 1916. Something's definitely wrong with Jerry. At last night, we heard the most god-awful noises. We stood for an hour expecting an attack that never came, listening to the screams from across no man's land. We heard shots too, though none aimed at us. At dawn, we could see Jerry moving about in their trench. It sounded like they were digging. Dead quiet after that until mid-morning when the shelling started up again from our side. Some of the lads are saying it's mutiny and that we could take their trench if we attacked, but for now, we carry on waiting. 22nd October 1916. It happened. Just after stand 2 at 4:30, the sentry raised the alarm. German attack incoming. It was a ragged mob, maybe 30 or 40. We gave them hell. Lewis guns, rifles, bombs, the lot. Some fell early, others kept coming, but when I looked down my sights at this poor bugger, he wasn't even holding a weapon. None of them were. We didn't hear them shouting, "Comrade, comrade," in English until Sergeant Lowe called ceasefire, and by then, most of them were cut down. It made for a terrible sight. The man carrying the white flag was one of the first to die, and in the morning haze, no one had seen it. Only 6 of them survived. Me and 4 others went out with a covering party to bring them in, all in a dreadful state. They looked half mad with torn uniforms and wild eyes. One had bites all over his hands and face, and they kept pointing back at their own trenches and saying things we didn't understand. The medical officer patched them up as best he could, and now they're being questioned. 23rd October 1916. Spent the day on fatigues but couldn't stop thinking about those Germans. Another lad managed to speak to one through an interpreter, and what he told us has left the whole dugout quiet. He said about a month before we arrived at the front that they'd been digging to expand their ammunition bunker when a soldier found something like an old toy animal carved out of wood and packed deep in the soil. They tried it out as best they could, then tried using it for firewood, but the thing wouldn't burn. And then after that, the trench rats started to behave differently. They stopped running away when threatened, and then at night, they bite little chunks out of men as they slept, and soldiers would wake up screaming to find their fingers or toes bleeding. They set traps, poisoned bait, and shot them by the dozen, but more showed up, bigger ones. At one point, one of their runners took a piece of shrapnel and was dragged back paralyzed from the waist down. It must have been a grim wound, but their M.O. thought that he had a chance of getting the feeling in his legs back, and so the next morning, when it looked like they were moving under his blanket, they were pleased as punch. The runner woke up confused, but when his comrades pulled back the blanket, they saw it wasn't his legs that were moving, but rather the big, fat, blood-soaked rats that had been feasting on paralyzed flesh. The corporal crossed himself 3 times telling this story, but it didn't stop there. Bigger rats started appearing, all deformed like the ones you see near the matchworks. Some had extra limbs or 2 heads, others were blind and hairless with milky eyes and honed in on the soldiers using the sounds of their screams. The Germans said that on the night before their surrender, the rats seemed to swarm the whole trench, and in the morning, the survivors broke and ran towards us, preferring British bullets to the things that they were hoping to escape. We thought that those men were mad at first, but we've all seen the shell-shocked, and this is not that. 24th October 1916. More details are leaking out now. Another prisoner confirmed the mutated rats, said one was the size of a small dog with a snout like a pig. He said the ground itself seemed to move at night. Tunnels would collapse, new holes would appear. Their chaplain had called it the work of the devil before he himself disappeared. The men are scared and they've come to our trench too. Sergeant Lowe said that that's impossible, that they're too far away. But last time I was on watch, I happened across a big one that hissed at me, like a cat would. I've never seen that before. The captain didn't report any of it up the chain, probably put down as enemy morale collapse due to sustained artillery, but we know different. 25th October 1916. It's gone quiet again. We've reinforced our wire and doubled the listening post, but everyone is still nervous. The captured Germans have been taken rearward. One of them grabbed my sleeve before he went and said, "Sie haben Hunger." They are hungry. I can't get the look in his eyes out of my mind, and I keep checking my boots before I sleep. Maybe the land is really cursed. We buried so many here, British, French, and German. Maybe as the rats ate what remained of them, they ate their anger too. God help us if they ever turn on us the way that they turned on Jerry. 28th October, 1916. Relieved at last. The new battalion moving up gave us funny looks when we warned them about the rats. I pray they don't learn the way that the Germans did. If I don't make it home, perhaps someone will read this and understand that not every horror on the Western Front came from German guns. Some came from below, and I still hear the screams in my sleep. My name's Simon. I'm from the United Kingdom, and I'm a research fellow at Durham University. I've had a fixed-term salaried position for a couple of years now, and I specialize in researching the English Civil War. Basically, the King of England at the time was a man named Charles I. England also had a parliament at this time, but Charles wasn't a fan and cancelled it on 4 separate occasions for varying reasons. Well, the people who supported Parliament got pretty sick of this, and there were a lot of them too, so in August of 1642, a great many of them took up arms against the crown. 3 years in, pro-Parliament rebels set up the New Model Army, the first centrally funded and professionally military force in England. It proved unstoppable, and within just 16 months later, the King of England was a prisoner of war. But things didn't stop there. After a lengthy period of imprisonment and negotiation, the king still refused to make the concessions demanded of him. The rebels therefore refused to release him, which caused those still loyal to the king to begin a sort of counter-revolution. And so, realizing that they had no choice but to put the king to death, to end any hope of returning him to the throne, Charles I was beheaded at the Palace of Whitehall on the 30th of January, 1649. His final words to the gathering of onlookers were reported to be, "I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." And what followed was complicated. A bloke named Oliver Cromwell took the king's place, cancelled Christmas, and then attacked his former allies in Scotland just to bring them to heel. He then sailed over to Ireland, started a war in which hundreds of thousands were lost to disease and famine, and then 2 years after his death, and after all the country had been through, the English monarchy was restored. It makes for an incredibly confusing and complicated period of English history, and researching it is not for the faint of heart, especially when it comes to incidents such as the one I'm about to tell you about. And so, in September of last year, I was researching rebel companies raised primarily from the West Riding of Yorkshire. People joined up with parliamentarians for a variety of reasons, but some joined out of sheer religious zealotry, believing Charles I was a representative of the literal Antichrist in the form of the Roman Pope. Now, these men were often called Puritans, and in contrast to the long ringlets worn by royalists, they wore hairstyles so short that they were nicknamed Roundheads. Many a Roundhead joined up to fight the forces of the Antichrist, including a man by the name of John Graves. Graves was born in Leeds in 1618, and as the son of a prosperous merchant, he was educated at a local grammar school. Now, it was here that he developed his Puritan belief system, along with a deep knowledge of Scripture, and prior to the war, he earned a living working with his father. And yet, when the Earl of Manchester declared war against the crown, John saw his chance to rid England of royal tyranny and joined a regiment on foot, or what would now be called the infantry. He distinguished himself with courage under fire, as well as his ability to maintain troop morale using nothing but shouted prayers. And then by the time the New Model Army was formed, Graves' commanding officer personally selected him as a captain and gave him command of a newly raised company. Nicknamed the Preacher for his habit of vociferous intercessions to God, contemporaries describe Captain Graves as stern but fair, physically imposing, and utterly fearless in combat. Yet in the spring of 1646, just 6 weeks before the king's capture, Graves approached his commanding officer, confessed to murdering 4 of his own men, then requested he be executed by hanging. Graves' confession was a shocking one, as was his request, but after reviewing the evidence, his CO signed his death warrant, and he was hanged by the neck until dead on the 27th of April, 1646. Graves' death warrant survives until this day, and written on it are the names of his victims, all soldiers in Colonel John Bright's regiment of foot. And so it was through Bright's regimental archives that I was able to find out much, much more regarding Graves and his company. And based on the dates present on the death warrant, I discovered that the same day Captain Graves murdered his men, his company attempted to occupy a village called Barmby-on-the-Marsh. And from what I could tell, they were met with fierce royalist resistance. Over the 118 men that advanced on Barmby that morning, only 14 managed to escape alive, including Graves himself, his lieutenant, and a dozen pikes and handgunners. The rest lay dead or dying among Barmby's muddy lanes and the marshes which surrounded it. Despite inflicting 5 times the casualties upon their enemy, the company's attack had been an unmitigated disaster, and such were the extent of their wounds that 3 of these walking wounded failed to survive the night, even after being taken to a nearby field hospital. Regimental death tolls describe their wounds as horrific. Some missing arms, some missing legs, and some disemboweled. But it wasn't these soldiers that Captain Graves murdered. No. It was 4 others, who, according to hospital records, had promising prognoses resulting from only light injuries. To try and further unravel the mystery of what had happened to Captain Graves's company, I began searching through Royalist archives to find out which unit had been stationed in Barmby at the time of Graves' attack. But to my surprise, there were no records whatsoever of any such Royalist companies being stationed there at all. In fact, the only reference to Barmby in any of the Royalist archives was in a letter one officer had written to another, mocking the Roundheads for not only attacking a place with no Royalist presence, but one which had been quarantined for plague. And the letter notes with disgust that the Barmby occupants were cruelly put to the sword and its buildings burned to the ground. But while its mention is the only one I could locate within Royalist archives, the letter isn't the only contemporary source which mentions Barmby on the Marsh. After looking up everything I could find which mentioned the village, I found a series of letters written between 2 members of the Yorkshire clergy. I learned that a church tithe collector had been dispatched to Barmby to collect contributions, but had since failed to return. Fearing the man had absconded with the tithes, the church sent a pair of bailiffs down to Barmby to track the man's movements. They returned with no collector, no tithes, and some deeply chilling news. As they approached the village, the 2 men broke from a section of woods and emerged onto an open field which allowed them a full and clear view of the village and its occupants. The fields were empty, but the village's narrow lanes were full of people, hundreds of them, and they appeared to be dancing. Yet, as bizarre as it might sound, the sight was not an altogether unfamiliar one for the 2 men, and allow me to explain why. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, there came to exist a phenomenon known as dancing mania, or as it was sometimes referred to, St. Vitus's dance. This was a bizarre sort of choreomania that took over entire cities in medieval Europe, whereby people in their hundreds and sometimes thousands began dancing wildly and uncontrollably, and in some cases for days at a time. Some of these incidents, like the French city of Strasbourg in 1518, were started by only a handful of revelers, but the condition spread so fast that sometimes within just a day or two, the crowd of dancers swelled from dozens to literally thousands of people, and some of these people danced until they died. They'd collapse from exhaustion, dehydration, or heat stroke, and since their fellow citizens were unable to stop dancing, they were also unable to render aid. Hundreds are reported to have died this way, and the phenomenon caused such a panic that people blamed everything from curses and witchcraft to demonic possession or heavenly punishment. In modern times, these outbreaks of dancing mania are believed to have been caused by mass hysteria, which in turn was triggered by things like war weariness, famine, or even outbreaks of disease such as the Black Death. Later, the name St. Vitus dance became the common name for Sydenham's chorea, a very real medical condition which causes jerky, involuntary movements, usually following a strep infection or a bout of rheumatic fever. But as you can probably guess, that's not what was affecting the people of Barmby. It's also not entirely clear why Captain Graves's company was given the order to attack the village, as existing records state only that the orders were given, and not why it was given. And yet I suspected that given the nature of the afflictions suffered by the villagers, Captain Graves' reputation as a lay preacher might have singled him out for selection. I imagine that, at least in the minds of his commanding officer, Graves was sent to remind the villagers of God's word. And yet it seems that in his efforts to prepare the village for a larger garrison of Roundhead troops, Graves and his men were set upon by the frenzied villagers in a viciously violent fashion. And what followed was a massacre, not just of the 500 or so villagers that called Barmby home, but of Graves' soldiers, and without access to any military-grade weaponry, it seems the soldiers were killed using little more than household implements, farming tools, and the villagers' own bare hands. And they were eventually overcome, all 500 plus of them, but as I've already mentioned, almost 90% of Graves' men were killed or so gravely wounded that they were unable to be evacuated. And the only thing they didn't destroy was the church. And then once all other buildings had been set ablaze, the survivors of Captain Graves' company retreated to their garrison near Leeds. Regarding what I've learned about the nature of the village's strange affliction, I believe we're forced to entertain a very frightening theory pertaining to Captain Graves' supposed crimes. And to me, it's quite clear that the soldiers he killed either outwardly exhibited symptoms of the mania, or he at least believed this to be so. There's no record of him mentioning anything of the plague or its symptoms during his confession, but I can think of no other reason why Graves would slaughter 4 of his own men while sparing other much more critically wounded soldiers. Part of me believes that in his request to be hanged, Graves wasn't only seeking to atone for his crimes. I think he wanted to die unblemished while his soul was still free of the devil's clutches. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that as a fanatical Puritan, Graves believed that exposure to demonic possession would put his own soul at risk. And having preferred to shed his own men's blood rather than see them overcome by unholy reverie, I think he sought to follow them into oblivion, while there was still a chance of him entering heaven as a repentant sinner. Obviously, I believe there's entirely rational explanations for what happened to Graves and his men, and while I understand his zealous regard for the health of his own soul, I believe it's entirely misplaced. I posit this to be yet another unfortunate misunderstanding in a war that is full of them, but I don't believe the same can be said for Captain Graves and his men, who no doubt will have believed themselves to be set upon by screaming, dancing, frenzied children of the devil himself. They must have killed them without mercy, and the manner in which their comrades were torn apart before their very eyes must have done nothing to dispel the idea that their enemies were in the service of Satan. And thus we bid our farewells to a man whose story is almost like a singular piece in a gigantic jigsaw puzzle. On its own, one might be mistaken for thinking it senseless, perhaps even confusing. But united with its kind, it helps paint a picture of a brutal civil conflict, and in a world where the devil himself was considered to be both very real. So I've got a quick story about the time my then-girlfriend kicked me out. Now, don't worry, it's not some psycho relationship gone wrong story, but it's about the camping trip that I took afterward to commiserate. Now, I know you seem to like outdoorsy stories, so I figured that I'd shoot my shot and try submitting something. This happened about 7 years ago. My then-girlfriend, I'll just call her Erin here, was finally sick of my crap and kicked me out. I don't blame her. I was a hot mess back then. No jobs, no prospects, happy to just coast through life on her dime. And the only thing I was really passionate about was vacationing. The camping had been Erin's thing, and I was more into partying with the boys and going on spring break type vacations. But Erin had convinced me to try camping early in our relationship, and I was immediately hooked. I got to party and have fun in the evenings, but hike and feel at one with nature during the day, like it was actually achieving something. We had this one campsite we'll go to regularly, which Erin had been visiting with her family since she was a kid. It wasn't completely remote, but not super commercial either. A mixture of individual campers and groups dotted around an area that had sporadic park ranger patrols. Erin and I had our usual little spot, and that's where I dragged myself on my lonesome, tail between my legs. Erin had thrown me out and told me it was over, and I was feeling extremely sorry for myself. We planned the camping trip for months, and I convinced myself that I was somehow defying her and her accusations that I was codependent by going alone. Now, I'll also admit that I had the faintest hope that Erin would show up at the site herself, either alone or with her family, and we could have some big reconciliation. That didn't happen, obviously. A family did show up, though, only it was not Erin's. I was kind of surprised to find a car near my tent on the second morning of my vacation. It was unusual for people to camp right next to each other if they were strangers, and in all my time visiting that campsite, I'd never seen anyone camping in that particular spot either, because it wasn't exactly the best ground for it. But that morning, as I blinked and ate my way through a hangover, I watched as the Johnson family, as I'll call them, unloaded their stuff and set up their tent. I picked up that they were the Johnsons by sitting there in my fold-out chair, defiantly munching on sausages and staring at them in the hope that they'd go away. I wanted to make my presence as unwelcome as possible and either pick a fight or be left alone. It reflected the dark mood that I was in, and I'd come here to get away from everything, commiserate over Aaron alone, and here was some nuclear family with 2.4 children and a perfect life. It felt like a kick in the face from the universe. I continued to watch them later in the day, looking over the top of the book that I was reading, and it soon became clear that they were far from the perfect family. For one thing, the mother and father barely spoke to each other. All I could hear was the dad constantly yelling at the two kids, a boy and a girl, and he kept saying things like, "The Johnsons do not conduct themselves like this," and "The Johnsons help each other," and "The Johnsons don't act like brats." The name wasn't actually the Johnsons. I forget what they actually called themselves. It was something similar, though. And it started to give me a headache, hearing him yell at his kids in his high-pitched, nasally voice. And it kind of amused me, though, to see how the kids just entirely ignored him. They acted as if he wasn't even there, and occasionally, when he'd really raise his voice, they might glance in his direction or even laugh at him. But for the most part, they just sort of chased each other around. They only seemed interested in hurling insults at each other, these two weird little kids. Now, they must have been about 8 to 10 months old, but some of the crude things that they were yelling were way too inappropriate to share here on YouTube. And the worse their insults to each other were, the angrier their dad got. Meanwhile, the mom of the Johnson family sat on some portable sunning chair, the one thing that she'd removed from the car by herself, and just sort of watched. When the day started to get really hot, I kind of just was shocked and a little embarrassed to notice that she'd started sunbathing without a top on. The dad seemed to notice this too and saw that I was looking, and it stressed him even further. Now, I could tell that he wanted to say something to me, but he also wouldn't let himself. Now, for my part, I was in a bad mood and wanted to pick a fight, so I refused to be intimidated or move. And besides, in the language of the schoolyard, I was here first. And I started doubting whether I wanted to get into a fight with the Johnsons, though. The father got increasingly angry with his kids, speaking to them in a way that I'd never even heard a parent speak to their children before. And at one point, he grabbed the son's arm and yanked it so hard that I was certain that the son would react. He did react, but not in the pained and hurt way that I expected. Instead, he just called his dad some slur and ran off chasing his sister again. And the entire family was utterly and horrifyingly obnoxious. Well, I'd first thought the universe was taunting me by showing me what I could have had with Aaron. Now I thought it was saving me by, well, showing me what I could have had with Aaron. Childish, but I was directing my anger at her towards this awful family, sitting there just scowling at them while nursing my beer. Eventually, it became overcast and the mom got dressed again. The family built a campfire in their designated fire pit, the one benefit to the place I'd chosen to set up camp. I watched as the horrible children ran around it, getting dangerously close to the fire. Dad Johnson kept shrieking at them, threatening to beat them. The mom kept stealing looks at me and offering me little smiles, even a flirty wink. Now, I knew I should have turned my chair away or gone off to do something else, but I was being an idiot. I was also kind of enjoying how angry this father was getting and reveling in my role in it. I'd circled back around to the kind of drunk where you're happy to pick a fight and don't care who it's with. Only a few beers deep, but enough to be a dick. Now, this is probably one of the reasons Aaron kicked me out. You could tell the father wanted to say something to me too, and I was kind of disappointed when the evening ended and he hadn't, and I was forced inside my tent by a chill wind that had whipped up. Now, I went inside my tent to read by flashlight and had to listen to the screaming awful children and the screaming awful father for what felt like forever. Now, eventually I realized that I'd drifted off to sleep and the campsite was silent. I needed to pee badly, so I crawled out of my tent and made an excursion into the outskirts of the woods. By the time the Johnsons' tent was silent, there was no sign of any disruption or trouble. I went back into my tent, suddenly freezing cold, and tried to go back to sleep. Now, shortly after, though, I heard yelling from the direction of that horrible family. I rolled my eyes, figuring that we were back to bad behavior again, but I quickly realized that the yelling and screaming had taken on a different tone. The mother and daughter both seemed to be screaming at each other about something that the daughter had done, and I don't know whether they were talking about the father or the son, but I'm sure that I'd heard the mother yell something like, "What did you do to him?" That one sentence made my blood run cold. I tried to summon up some of the bravado that I'd felt earlier so I could drag myself out of my tent and go over there to see if they needed any help. Then I heard a crack and a slap, and some more screaming, and decided that maybe it was probably best if I stayed put. I did have some cell reception though, so I placed a quick call to the cops to inform them that, that terrible family camping next to me might literally be killing each other right now. Now, helpfully, this dispatch put me through to an officer who informed me that the campsite was outside the local police jurisdiction, so I could call the park ranger for any non-emergency issues. I tried to explain that I was pretty sure that they might be hurting each other, but I guess something about my slurred words or delivery caused them to doubt me. Now, meanwhile, I tried to reconnect the painfully slow 4G to Google the number for the park ranger, and on the next tent over, the Johnsons seemed to be shrieking at each other again, and one of the male voices had joined in that fray. I couldn't tell if it was the son or the father with how high-pitched and shrill the father could get. I don't know for sure, but taking into account the things that they were screaming at each other about, I'm almost certain that one of the kids had either killed the father or killed the other sibling. At least the mom seemed to think so, and was screaming at them about getting out of here and making things right. I know I was a total coward by hiding in my tent, but I cannot stress just how intimidating and horrifying this family had become. To this day, I've never met people like it, so I kind of just continued trying to call the park ranger while pretending I wasn't actually there. Eventually, it became too hard to ignore, though. The screaming died down, and through the wall of my tent, I could see what looked like flames starting to glow. Now, I was pretty certain that it wasn't the campfire either. That was it. And enough was enough. Time to insert myself into that situation. And so I dragged myself to the door of my tent and began to unzip it. I was going pretty slow, trying to delay the inevitable, and that's when I glanced up and saw the family's 4x4 light up and start gunning right towards me. And holy God, they were going to run me down and crush me, it seemed, and I would be absolutely obliterated by their vehicle. I managed to tear that tent open and throw myself out of the path of their vehicle just in time, and everything I'd brought camping got churned up under the wheels of this now speeding vehicle, and I watched in horror as the Johnsons, whichever members were alive anyway, went barreling off in their vehicle. I'm still furious at myself that I wasn't able to memorize their license plate. I called 911 again, and this time they took me seriously when I told them someone had tried to kill me. The cops showed up shortly after, by which time I managed to put the fire out that those Johnsons had left behind, literally, and the blaze that I'd seen through my tent had been their tent on fire. It wasn't as serious as it looked, and I managed to extinguish it with just a few water bottles and dirt, and as I doused it though, I was almost certain that I'd seen a body in the smoldering wreckage, although whether son Johnson or father Johnson I wasn't sure. I didn't see a body though, so instead I was left to dwell on the sickening sight of that 4x4 speeding towards me in the darkness. I was extremely lucky that the driver, the mom I assumed, switched the headlights to a low beam. If they had been off entirely, then I might not have noticed that the vehicle was headed straight towards me other than sound. If they'd been full, then they might have blinded me. I run all the different variations over in my head whenever I think about it. It's the closest I ever come to dying by far. I'm not ashamed to admit that even 5 years later, I'm still in therapy over this, and it's the sight of that car charging towards me that I always end up coming back to. The rest of the story really isn't that interesting. I gave my story to the cops. They promised to keep me informed, and they never did. I have no idea if any member of that family died that night, and I do know that they would have happily killed me if I hadn't dodged out of the way at the final second, though. I don't know if they were aiming for me or simply forgot that I was there. I just hope it was the latter, but I think it was the former. Either way, screw you to the Johnsons. I hope that your horrible family was caught for whatever crimes you committed and you never had a chance to hurt anyone. I hope those kids managed to get the care that they needed, and the one silver lining was that my encounter with those Johnsons made me feel grateful that I was single, and I kind of stopped dwelling on Aaron very quickly after something like that. I'm still single to this day, and if married life is anything like it was for the Johnsons, then I'm happy to stay away. So I have this absolutely weird quick story from a time when I went camping alone. I guess it's not the most safe thing that you can do, but I did it a lot and still do. And this one event caused me to take a little break from camping by myself though, and it still creeps me out to think about it. So I was off the beaten track on a trail that I'd plotted myself out in the Adirondacks. I'd hung out in this area a few times, just reading and chilling, and not for a couple of years though. Now this time, I was 2 days into the 3-day trek that it would take to reach my usual camping spot. Now on the way, I saw some pretty odd things. Specifically, I saw a bunch of trees filled with holes. Now okay, you might say to yourself, some hunters have been using them for target practice. That's what I thought too, at first anyway. It wasn't really a hunting area, but that wouldn't have stopped some local kids from coming out here and firing harmlessly into the trees for fun. When I examined the holes more closely though, they didn't look like bullet holes. There was no splintering and not much breakage in the bark around them. It looked like they'd been drilled. Now I remember watching a YouTube documentary about a farm in Canada that makes maple syrup, and it reminded me of how trees get tapped for that. Now I'm pretty sure that these weren't syrup dispensing trees though, or even maples at all. They did leak sap, but it was normal, stinking tree sap that had dried in a few of the holes. Now the further I went in towards my planned camping spot, the more trees that I found with the holes drilled in them, and I was super confused. Was this some kind of woodpecker, or maybe a creature? Now, the deeper into the woods I got, the fresher the holes seemed to be as well. Some of them were still leaking this sap, and they absolutely stunk. I have no idea what kind of trees I was encountering. I really wasn't all that into nature or like a nature buff or anything, but they absolutely stank of, well, how do I really describe it? You know the scent when you've just mowed the lawn, but you leave the cuttings out a bit too long and they start to sort of smell bad and maybe even weird? And then you throw some wet bark in there and maybe some food leftovers and make compost. That's kind of what it smelled like, but maybe more tangy. Certainly nothing like delicious maple syrup. Now, against my better judgment, I put my finger against the sap and licked a tiny dab from my fingertip. And it was freaking gross. Nobody would be tapping this to eat it, I imagine. Well, I was proven wrong as I made my way through the trees some more and saw the man. He was drilling a tree with what looked like a handle-operated hand drill. He hadn't seen me, so I crouched down and watched him from behind a trunk. The guy was drilling into the tree and then sucking the sap directly from it. After he'd inhaled a bunch of that sap, he'd throw his head back and make this disgusting lip-smacking sound. I felt kind of sick, knowing how plant-like the sap tasted. If the guy hadn't been wearing clothes and using a human drill, I would have thought that I'd encountered a Sasquatch or something like that. He was huge. He was tall, hairy, and he was sucking on a tree. That ain't normal human behavior, bro. And so you can imagine why I wanted to just sneak away and avoid interacting with this guy, right? Well, screw my life, I suppose, because I tried to sneak away very stealthily and covert and immediately stepped on a stick. And it cracked like a freaking bomb blast in that silent forest. Now straight away I heard the sound of thundering footsteps and turned just in time to see this tree sucker charging right at me. And he seemed absolutely furious that I'd been watching him drill and suck on trees. And yeah, it sounds funny to describe it, but trust me, it was not funny to have some huge angry man charging you down in the middle of nowhere. He was waving that drill over his head too, and all I could focus on was the handle spinning around. Thankfully, I snapped out of that daze real quick and managed to start running. The guy was intimidating and scary, but he was huge and slow, and I was young and fit. After a few hours of heart-pounding pursuit, I was confident that I'd lost him. I'd also managed to run off onto a different route and could no longer see any drilled trees, so I felt more secure knowing that I was in an area that guy obviously wasn't familiar with. I managed to reach my car and civilization by pushing myself pretty far. I took a couple of naps in some ditches, not wanting to set up my tent or do anything that could slow me down. It was a miserable and scary experience. And later, when I was close to the car, I found more trees with holes drilled into them, and that put me on the defensive again, but thankfully that sapsucker didn't show up again. I made it back to the car and hightailed it out of there, and I have not been back to that area since, which I think is quite understandable. Now, I don't know what the huge tree-sucking forest guy would have done if he caught me, and I certainly don't want to go back there and give him the chance to catch me again and find out exactly why he was even doing what he was doing. If you go camping off the beaten trail in a bunch of places in America, but especially the Appalachian Trail, you're guaranteed to find some very weird things. Now, I have a whole catalog of strange sights I've seen, either in groups or by myself, but nothing beats the time that I stumbled across an entire set of dining furniture rotting away in the absolute middle of nowhere. Now, when I say the middle of nowhere, I absolutely mean it. This wasn't somewhere that it was feasible to dump your trash. This table and 6 chairs must have been carried for days through the woods, as far as I could tell, and it would have taken a bunch of people to carry it here. And that's why it was so strange and unsettling. And the chairs were actually set up around the table, as if it had been installed here as some kind of picnic spot. Only, this wasn't any actual trail or any location that would be nice to chill and hang out at. It was just sort of there, in the overgrowth. The wood was all wet and rotten, and insects and crap were swarmed all over it, and it was pretty disgusting, and naturally, a lover of the creepy and strange, I loved it. The dining set might not have been a good spot, but there was a clearing a few hundred yards away that offered a perfect camping site. I decided that this was as good a place as any to set up for the night, and so I pitched my tent and went about heating up some stew on my camp heater. Now, later that night, I was lying in the tent, completely unable to sleep. I was just taking in the sounds of the forest and the chill vibes of being alone in nature. This was my favorite part of the whole experience, honestly. At least, usually it was. That night, though, I felt the hairs stand up on the back of my arms as I heard a number of footsteps coming through the forest. Not super close, maybe a few hundred yards away, and you can guess exactly what direction they were probably coming from. I waited for the sounds to die down, then all I could hear was the low murmur of talking. I unzipped the tent ever so slightly and crawled out. There was a faint light coming from the direction in which I'd seen the dining table, and so I got my singular binocular out and tried to watch. There were 3 younger men seated at that rotting dining table, and then one older guy who I swear to God even had an eye patch. The night was near silence, so I could hear snatches of their conversation, and it seemed like they were playing some type of card game at the table, but they were also talking about their kills. They were very clearly poachers because they were talking about shooting and stealing deer from some nearby private land. And then I heard one of them ask something about what they were going to do with the other body. As I listened in horror for some time, it became pretty clear, at least in my head, that these 4 men had killed another person and were planning on how to dispose of their body. From what I could tell, the man that they'd killed was some type of family member, and he had it coming, according to them at least. But they were discussing the best way to discard of that body. I tried to convince myself that I was wrong, that they were talking about an animal, but the more I listened, the more I was sure. And then I realized that I had a major problem. They had no idea that I was there, but if they found out, would they even hesitate in doing something bad to me as well? I had no idea what to do. I could stay silent and dark in the tent, or I could try crawling away to hide just in case. I knew running would be a mistake because they would almost certainly have firearms and knew the land way better than I did. And my God, I'm so glad that I picked the option to crawl into a hiding place. I dragged myself out of my tent and sort of army crawled across the ground until I found an overhang ditch that I'd seen earlier in the day. I tucked myself in there and covered myself with some grass and bush, hoping that even if they saw my tent, they would probably overlook me. Well, they eventually did see my tent, and when they went to look and eventually decided that I must have abandoned my campsite, I was actually surprised at how quickly they gave up because, hot damn, the way they talked about things, I'm 100% certain that they would have ended me if they'd actually found me. But nonetheless, I stayed in that ditch for hours, long after the men had left, just lying in that hole, too scared to really even breathe or step out. I had to pee myself twice. I'm not ashamed to say it, really. And eventually I gathered the courage to drag myself out of my hiding place and just hightail it out of there. As soon as I reached the car and could drive to a spot where I had cell reception, I phoned the police. Now, this was a few years ago, so finding cell reception wasn't easy, and I wasn't able to give the cops much. I didn't have a clear description of the men, and I wasn't able to pinpoint exactly where I'd seen them. They asked me to go into the local station, and I did, but they seemed more frustrated and annoyed with me than anything else. The cops promised that they'd let me know if they needed anything else from me, and I gave them my home phone number and email asking them to promise to give me any updates. Well, I never heard anything else, and in the years since then I've scoured any sort of local news of that area in Appalachia for any news of a body being discovered. But here's the depressing thing. The answer isn't there was never a body found. Instead, bodies are found all the time out there. I have no idea if one of the many unidentified dead people who have been discovered in the years since were potentially the victim that I'd heard about. All I know is that it's very dangerous out there and you probably shouldn't go hiking alone like I used to. Now I know, you probably heard it in Zelda, but it is dangerous to go alone. Camp in groups, friends. Don't find yourself hiding all night in a ditch like I was. I'm a female listener in my early 20s. Before I start the story, I'll tell you all up front that I am safe, warm, and well these days. I have a long-term partner who I live with, and I'm no longer homeless or in any danger. That wasn't the case a few years ago, though. I was living rough, either sleeping out in the open in a sleeping bag, or for a while I had a small pop-up tent until it got all slashed up. I know some people prefer the term unhoused for when they were living rough, but not me. I know what I was. I was homeless. I did not have a home. I didn't have a community or a single safe place to stay. And it was hell. I hated it. I felt like I had to be constantly on the move, sometimes multiple times within the same night, and it was an extremely unsafe, unpleasant world for a young woman like me, and it's frankly a miracle that I managed to come out the other side of it relatively unscathed. Now, I genuinely do believe that it was a miracle, like someone was watching over me, and I had so many narrow misses and managed to scare off so many different predators. There was one incident that really stuck with me, though, and it was the closest I ever came to something terrible happening. It was the final day I got to spend with my pop-up tent. I didn't know that at the time, of course, but yeah. I was dog-tired because I've been walking all day, so I set the tent up under what seemed to be a remote overpass. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, as I'd been walking kinda aimlessly for a while, I guess. Now, I'll admit I was floating on some kind of substance I won't name right now, and when you're living rough, you take whatever escape you can get. I always tried to keep things very grounded, though, just enough to take the edge off. I had a little food squirreled away in the tote bag, so I allowed myself something to eat to lessen the gnawing hunger that I always seemed to feel. It was fall and fairly mild, but the weather was set to worsen soon. I was not excited about the prospect of spending another winter on the streets. I read a few magazines that I managed to find and a 3-day-old newspaper that I've been holding onto for warmth. The location that I picked seemed completely remote and isolated, and for the first time in days, I let myself drift off and drop my guard. Now, I woke up startled. There had been a loud sound from outside my tent, sort of like a bark or something. I heard it again and realized that it was a laugh, like a single, raspy laugh. And the laugh sounded like it was coming from someone very old. I could hear the telltale rattle of smokers' cough in their lungs as they laughed a third time. I had to make a decision: stay hidden in the tent and hope this guy moved on, or introduce myself and make it clear that I wasn't someone to mess with. I didn't actually have time to decide either way. Before I even had a chance to move, a very heavy body plunged onto the tent. It was almost like he jumped on me from a height, and I'm pretty sure that's exactly what he did. It was almost like some type of wrestler move, except I'd soon discover that he was just some dirty old-ass man. Now, he managed to come ripping through my tent fabric with some kind of blade. Now, I picked up on the blade first and was immediately on high alert. A fat hand holding some kind of box cutter burst through the wall of the collapsed tent, flailing towards me. I kicked out and managed to catch him by surprise, so he actually dropped the knife, I think. Now, the first thing I did was grab it and cut the tent wall behind me so I could pull myself free from the fabric. I scrambled onto the cold, dirty ground and dragged myself to my feet. And that's when I saw him. This huge monster of an old man who'd apparently swan dived onto my tent while I was sleeping. He was absolutely filthy, and he stank of, well, you can only imagine what homeless people stink of. And the whole time he flailed and wriggled, he kept letting out this single rasping laugh, too. There was a single flickering light under the overpass, so I was able to see a few details about this man. His face was completely scarred, and his nose was kind of burned away like an addict's. He had a cleft lip and his tiny, evil little piggy eyes. When he actually saw me, as in he saw that the inhabitant of the tent was a young, small female, he managed to get to his feet very quick. He had this look on his face then, predatory but also wary. I guess he knew that a lone woman sleeping rough can be hella dangerous out of necessity, especially now that I'd already gotten hold of his knife. And because of the way he was looking, I assumed that he'd case me out and be careful. But no. Before I even had a chance to realize what he was doing, this huge, stinking man barreled into me, crashing across the ground and pinning me to the floor with his huge belly. Now, his knife went flying out of my hand and I immediately felt my heart sink. No time to dwell on that, though. His bulk was completely crushing me, and I could feel him pressing against me in ways I really obviously didn't want. And since I'd lost that blade to defend myself, I decided to just try and punch him repeatedly on the side of the head instead. His head seemed to be his weak spot, I think, and after a few hits, I even started to see a cut, dripping blood onto my own face, and that stinking old guy was just howling. Still laughing too, though, like he was extremely high on obviously something. He rolled off of me and I scrambled away. The dude was rolling back and forth on his back like some fat turtle, and it would have almost been funny if I hadn't been so terrified in that moment, my heart absolutely pounding. All of my worldly possessions were in that crushed, slashed tent, so I couldn't just run either. I had to grab up my tote bag first, and no way was I leaving everything for this a-hole. I quickly ran across the tent and fished out my bag out of that wreckage. And just as I thought that I was about to get away, I felt some hand grab me by the ankle. I slammed to the ground hard, and I later found out that I actually sprained my wrist pretty badly, which was kind of a miracle to think that that was the worst injury that I suffered from all of this attack. The guy pulled me towards him, muttering something I couldn't understand in the moment, and I don't even think it was English. He didn't seem to be American at all, but I have no idea what language he was even speaking. Maybe nothing coherent. His mouth seemed to be bleeding from me cutting into his frail skin, and one of his eyes was sort of leaking this disgusting yellow crap. He was an actual monster in my eyes at that time, and this was my worst nightmare, the kind of thing that I dreamed about at my lowest point. There was no way that I was letting my life end at the hands of this disgusting predator, and so I swung my bag hard, hit him again in the side of the face. He tumbles backwards, and I stomped down on his crotch with all of my strength. And then I just ran. And I didn't stop running until the sun was up, and I was back in a populated area. Now this was the wake-up call I needed to straighten my life out. Now I won't go through all the explanations on how I did that because that's the non-scary part. Thankfully I did though, and in the time that it took to finally get a bed to sleep in, I never encountered anyone else like that horrifying guy. This was only a few years ago. I wonder if he's still out there though. It's not like I went to the cops or anything, as that would have been totally out of the question for a person like me at the time. On the other hand, he looked like he was basically falling apart, so I'd be surprised if he'd survived much longer beyond that. Now, maybe it's not very Christian of me, but I kinda hope he's dead. He was a monster who tried to suplex a sleeping woman and do God knows what, and I'm pretty sure he has nothing positive to offer the world. All he exists as now is the face that I see when I have the worst of my nightmares. Be careful if you're ever forced into homelessness, kids. Don't do drugs, as there are all sorts of horrors out there waiting. A couple friends of mine listen to your podcast regularly and keep encouraging me to write into you with the story. Now, hopefully you find it as creepy as I did, because even though it happened over 15 years ago, it feels like yesterday whenever I remember it. To this day, I still don't know if I should have done something more than I did, and whenever I tell the story, nobody can give me a decisive answer of what they think I should have done either. So maybe you or your listeners can shed some insight or open my eyes to a new perspective. It drives me mad thinking about what else I could have done to help the guy in question in the story. Maybe because it ended with me being so helpless and useless to him. Now, for some background, when I was younger, I used to see myself as a bit of a wild explorer survivalist type. I had read all the books, seen all the shows, and kind of enjoyed having this air of rugged mystery to myself. I'm an extremely tall, broad fella, and combined with the sense of immortality you have in your early 20s, I felt pretty invincible. So all of this said, it's the reason why I spent a lot of my time camping by myself. One thing I'd say is that camping by yourself isn't actually the best idea. There's a whole bunch of things that can go wrong, especially if you're deep in the wilderness. If you need help, there's likely going to be nobody around to offer it, and if you come up against any adversity, man or nature, then more often than not, your body's going to be food for the crows, never to be found. Now, I've done my due diligence with warning you about the dangers. I can say that my years camping by myself are freaking awesome. There's nothing like braving it in nature all by yourself, knowing that your own survival relies solely on you and your decisions, and that one wrong step could send you spiraling to your doom, sometimes literally if you stumble off a cliff in the dark. Now, thankfully, I never managed to injure myself in that kind of way, which is a miracle when I look back at how reckless and stupid I could get. At the time, like I said, I enjoyed being a quiet, stoic man of mystery, so I didn't often recount my adventures to friends either. But when I did, they'd always scold me for being so irresponsible and tell me that one day I'd end up dead in a tree. Always in a tree too, according to one friend of mine who very much enjoyed the comforts of life. Not sure why he always assumed that I climbed into trees, but according to him, that's the way I was going to die. Maybe a leopard or something pulled me up there. I always laughed and brushed them off, and I don't think it really struck me at how correct they were until I found myself responsible for someone else's life. As much as I'd like to brag and tell you all about my death-defying exploits, it's this one final event towards the end of my camping days that really sticks with me. As I've said, I really focused on survival and isolation, so it was pretty rare for me to meet anyone else when I was out hiking. And so one day, 4 days into a planned 8-day hike, I was hella surprised when, almost out of nowhere, a guy came ambling into the clearing where I was setting up my tent. Immediately, I was on the defensive, being pretty much in the middle of nowhere and not having seen another living soul for days. And then, when I finally took in the guy's appearance, I felt more confused than defensive. Everything about this dude was wrong, at least in the middle of nowhere in the forest, that is. The main thing was that while I was decked out in full hiking gear, covered in mud and who knows what else, this guy was wearing what appeared to be a casual business suit. He looked like he'd just come strolling out of the office, at least in terms of what he was wearing. And the more I looked, though, the more disheveled I realized he was, and the more confused and scared he appeared to be. The first thing he said to me was to ask me where we were. I told him very gruffly and still in the defensive, and at first I wasn't sure that he'd heard me, because I have a tendency to sort of mumble and talk quietly. And then I realized his look of puzzlement was because he thought I was lying to him. We engaged in a bit more discussion, and I allowed myself to open up a little and accept that this dude wasn't out to kill me. I soon realized that he was very lost and unsure of himself. I kind of wondered if maybe he was drunk, but he also reminded me of when my great-grandma had suffered from dementia. There was this sort of glassy look in his eyes that disturbed me a little. Relaxing and deciding this guy wasn't a threat, I started being more gentle in how I spoke to him. I managed to coax the info out of him that he had no memory of how he'd woken up in the forest out here in the middle of nowhere, and the last thing he could remember was leaving work for about 4 days before. Either this guy had gone on the mother of all drinking binges, or he really was suffering some kind of severe head trauma. I tried asking if he could remember a blow to the head or anything like that, but he seemed completely unaware of anything that could have led him to where he is now. And let me just stress here for a moment, we really were out in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't somewhere that you could end up after wandering for an hour or so, or even for a day. And it really struck me how wild it was when the guy asked me for help in getting back to civilization, and we went over my map. Unless my wayfinding had somehow become way off, we were about 3 days from where I had left my vehicle in one direction, and about the same distance to the nearest town in the other. I figured that town must be where the guy had come from, and when I mentioned the name, his face actually brightened a little. He lived there with his girlfriend, he said, and he worked in the city during the week. Feeling kind of like an adventurer hero, I suggested to the guy that we camp out where I'd set up my tent so we could get some rest and warm some food up before we began the hike back to civilization the next day. It only struck me a bit later that I was inviting a stranger to watch over me while I slept, who could potentially be very dangerous whether knowingly or not. At the time, I didn't even really consider the ramifications of this, and like I said, I was young and reckless and arrogant. Thankfully, when I woke up the next day, the business suit guy hadn't murdered me in my sleep. He was in fact snoring in an extremely deep sleep, cramped up next to me in my one-man tent. I somehow managed to slip out without waking him and wash myself up, and then went about planning our most optimal route. I figured that I'd let this business guy sleep as long as he needed. We could even set out a day later if we had to, and I had enough provisions for probably at this point a year of survival, and the guy seemed to be in perfect physical health. Mentally, I wasn't sure, but I was confident that I could handle or wrangle this rogue businessman. But I prayed that he was just on something rather than suffering from head trauma or dementia. And after he'd woken up for the morning, it became clear that unfortunately this guy was suffering from some kind of mental issue though. He'd frequently drift off while talking to me, and his memory of lost events didn't seem to be any better than the previous night. Occasionally, I'd catch him looking at me in some strange way, almost hungrily or dangerously. And now it's probably obvious that I'm a stubborn idiot at this point, but at the time I refused to accept that this guy could be anything less than legitimate. Hell, maybe I'm only remembering these predatory looks by thinking back on it, I'm not really sure. But either way, I was at least sensible enough to insist that we head towards civilization that day. I loaned this guy some of my spare hiking gear, so he was at least a little equipped for the wilderness. And now that he wasn't wearing a suit, he almost passed as someone who belonged out there with me. And at the very least, he didn't unsettle me every time I looked at him. And as we walked through the woods, I realized that he was a surprisingly competent hiker. Too competent, it felt, looking back on it, but again, that just could be the benefit of hindsight. And as we walked, picking our way over some pretty rough terrain, the guy started talking about some fairly weird stuff. One thing that really sticks out to me was that he kept asking me what my views were on morality, specifically if I believed in an afterlife and what did I think happened to us after we die, etc. Again, looking back, this was really unsettling for a meeting with a stranger out of nowhere under these certain circumstances. Now back then I kind of was pretentious though, sort of a wannabe intellectual, so I treated his weird conversation topic with sincerity. I guess maybe some of it was adrenaline and denial as well. There wasn't much I could actually do about being stuck out there with a super weird guy, so the best survival tactic I had was denial and to just keep pressing on. This guy really shouldn't have been able to keep up with me if he really was an unprepared, mentally sick guy who found himself in a situation like this. I'm absolutely certain of that now. At the time, though, he managed to keep pace with me despite being a lot shorter and smaller than me, and I really pushed us both through our paces. I should add, too, that the guy looked to be maybe late 30s, early 40s, and I was in my early 20s, so I guess there was a degree of wanting to impress my elders. And there was also the fact of being unaware of just how much difference that age gap should have made to his overall fitness if he was unprepared. After a day's hard hiking, I found a clearing that I previously camped in by myself and told the guy that we'd set the tent up here to take a break for the night. It was by a small creek, so it was a nice camping spot that I used a few times, and we both enjoyed a refreshing wash in the creek, and I settled in to share some rations with him. I hoped that by talking to the guy that I might be able to shake his memory loose, but all I got were these stories about his day job, Most of them sounded kind of made up, like he'd taken them from books or TV shows, but there was nothing I could prove to be a clear lie. The next day, after somehow surviving a second night sleeping next to this dude, we began again. Now I call this second day Predator Day, and thankfully not because Business Guy revealed himself as a predator, but because he became convinced that we were being stalked by one. Now I'd like to add at this point that the reason I continue to call him Business Guy is that he never actually told me his name, and I was too much of a hothead to slow down and really ask. And it started within an hour of us going out for the day. The business guy grabbed my arm and slowed me down. At first I got kind of defensive and thought, oh god, this is it. He's making his move. But I summoned my inner Zen and I asked him what was up. He acted like I was stupid for not realizing it, but clammed up like it was some big secret. And then when I coaxed it out of him, he leaned in and whispered to me in a very exaggerated way to say that we were being followed. I told him we definitely weren't, that I'd trained myself to detect if I was being followed. I know I was kind of pretentious. I told you this already, but Business Guy sort of sneered at this and made as if he was going to say something smartass and then just didn't. Now looking back now, I'm convinced that he was going to say that I hadn't noticed him following me previously, but I can't be sure. I managed to convince him that we weren't being followed and to keep up the pace. About an hour later, he grabbed my arm again though and said something about how he was certain now we were definitely being stalked. Again, I told him we weren't, and I genuinely don't think we were. I asked him if he thought it was a person or a creature, and he said he wasn't sure. He said maybe it was a bear or a mountain lion, and I explained to him that neither of those animals were most likely going to be in this area, and that I definitely wouldn't be camping alone in an area with those kinds of things. Now the business guy sort of jeered at this as well, as if he knew better than me, and I reminded myself that this guy wasn't well mentally and I was just supposed to be helping him escape. Now some more time passed and the guy started really freaking out now. He was yelling for our stalker to come out and face us. He started shouting that we had a gun and weren't afraid to use it. Now as it happens, I did have a gun, a small pistol for protection, but I had made sure not to reveal that to this guy at any point, just in case. I wanted at least one piece of protection for if things went south. At this stage, I was fairly certain that they were about to go south too with all the screaming that this guy was doing. He acted so convinced and certain that we were being stalked that it started making me paranoid as well. And suddenly every movement was a threat. Every noise was an animal creeping up on us. Sure, bears and cougars weren't super common in this area at all, but that didn't mean that there couldn't be a stray killer animal out of its natural habitat, right? And at one point, I just about had a heart attack when a rabbit went dashing past us, disturbed by this business guy's yells. Now, I successfully managed to coax him into calming down and following me again, but this is where the guy starts to unravel. At the time, I assumed it was fatigue or illness affecting him, but sometimes when I play it back, I wonder if it was kind of a hunger. If this guy was planning on doing something terrible to me, and I stress that to this day I still don't know for sure, then maybe the itch to do it was getting under his skin. I don't know if maybe I was subconsciously thinking of this at the time, but I do remember that I pushed us real hard that day, and we continued hiking a while after the sun had gone down, which again is a really stupid thing to do, but at the time, I insisted that we'd be fine to hike by flashlight. I knew the area pretty well, and I also didn't want to stop while this business guy was still muttering about how we were being followed. Now, I'm fairly certain by the end of the day I was convinced that we were being followed too, even though I knew that that was impossible. Certainly, if we were being followed by an animal, it wouldn't have been able to stalk us unseen for an entire day. And finally, I allowed us to set up camp. And by my calculations, which were probably wrong looking back on it, we could reach my car by the next afternoon. I was feeling pretty pleased with myself at our progress. I was also still convincing myself that I'd saved this lost guy while ignoring all the red flags that I'd seen in retrospect. Or if not red flags, then at least pieces of evidence that proved things weren't entirely as they seemed at face value. I've retold this story countless times, and every time I do tell it, I remember something else I probably should have picked up on. And that night is where everything came to a head. We found a camping spot in the dark, as I said, which was a small miracle given how obscure the area was. My tent was one of those pop-out tents, so it wasn't hard to set up in the dark, and then go about setting up the portable camp heater that I'd been carting around. No campfires in unapproved areas, of course. At least I like to abide by the rules. And we sat around that heater for the third night, and I tried coaxing more memories or details out of this guy. And for the third night, he continued to insist that all he remembered was leaving work in the city and then waking up in the middle of the forest. Now, by now, even back then, I was really starting to question this whole thing, given that this guy had managed to hike back with me just fine despite being allegedly unprepared. I figured that if he hadn't killed me after 3 nights, then he wasn't going to, though, and he had some other reason for wanting me to guide him out of that forest. It felt safe to play along, is really what I'm trying to say. Now, we were ready to go to bed to our tents when the men came bursting into the clearing with flashlights. One of them shouted at me to stay calm and that everything was going to be okay now. Meanwhile, a couple of other guys had grabbed the business guy and were now handcuffing him. I squinted against the light shining in my face trying to make out who these guys were. Now, the way they were acting, they seemed like they were FBI or some other kind of law enforcement agency, and I think they were wearing unmarked jackets though, or at least I couldn't see any identifying marks in the dark. The guy who'd spoken to me flashed a badge at me which looked vaguely legitimate, but again it was very hard to tell in the nighttime, and I also couldn't see specifically which agency the badge was associated with, although in later years I've identified it as being almost certainly FBI. Now, it was an absolute whirlwind. This one guy, an agent or whatever he might have been, was constantly telling me to stay calm and that I was safe, almost as if he was trying to distract my attention from whatever was going on with that business guy. I tried to look around the man blocking my view while shielding my gaze from the flashlight in my eyes, and it seemed like they were bundling that guy away through the trees, and it struck me later that business guy didn't even say a word or make a sound throughout the whole ordeal. I swear I can remember him grinning as they took him away, but again, I could just be adding that detail in my mind. Now eventually, it was just myself and 2 of the agents, including the one who'd repeatedly told me I was safe. I expected them to, I don't know, debrief me or something, at least explain the situation. But no, nothing. They literally told me that I was safe now, and that I'd avoided a terrible fate, and then headed off into the trees. Now at the time, I was completely baffled. Of course, I didn't find out until later that I'd majorly miscalculated our entire route, so we were camping only about a half hour from the road. Finding this out later, it at least made sense how the men were able to locate and reach us, but it still left me with a few baffling and creepy questions. Who the hell was Business Guy, and why did he put on such a show of pretending to be a lost little sheep, if only to escort me back to my car? Was this the most elaborate carjacking ever? I don't know. And it also kills me not to know if the men who showed up were legitimate law enforcement or not. Either I got saved from some terrible fate or I handed Business Guy over to one. And over time, I've come to manage to convince myself that that guy had something awful planned for me. But that's only because the other possibility is probably too horrible to think about. What if I let a person in a genuine need get snatched up by God knows who? Now, I'm fairly certain that that guy was at least a bad player, though, because of a few things. 1. That night, after everything had died down and the men had left, I checked my pack for security. Now, I was horrified to discover that my gun, which I kept in a holster in a hidden compartment in the bag, was gone. The so-called law enforcement agents never went near my tent, so the gun could only have been taken by that business guy. And as I mentioned, I never told him about the gun. He must have been searching my belongings pretty thoroughly to find it. Secondly, I discovered that the small amount of money that I kept in the same pocket was also gone. Now, it was only about $100 or so, but enough to feel the sting at the time. And thirdly, when I reached the car the next morning, after finding I was much closer to the road than I thought, I made one final horrifying discovery. I have no proof that this was connected to the business guy in any way, but someone had slashed one of my tires. Thankfully only one, so I was able to replace it with a spare easily enough, but it was almost as if it had been done as a delaying tactic just in case. Maybe to give that guy the time to jump me or who knows what. Some of my friends are adamant that I encountered an unidentified serial killer of women who'd been operating near the area for a few years before I camped there. Now, this would explain why he was so sinister but didn't kill me, although it wouldn't explain what his plan or motive really was. Now, I genuinely have no idea, but the more years that passed, the more I'm certain that I narrowly avoided something terrible. I just can't decide if that fate would have been at the hands of the business guy or at the men who showed up at the end. And as much as I want to, I can't convince myself that I didn't just let dangerous people snatch up a vulnerable man. And it's kind of weird to actually hope for the fact that you spent multiple nights sleeping next to a predator, but I prefer that than to think that I'd let him down. I just wish that I knew for sure, or maybe I'm better off not knowing. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. I think you'll like it and you should check it out, as all the links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. Grief can do some strange things to people. That's what I was always told, anyway. My mom first told me that when one of my high school friends lost her sister and started dressing up and acting like her sister. It made sense to me then, and I went out of my way to befriend her. Now, we're still close BFFs to this day, incidentally, and that's relevant to the story because she's a bit of a Let's Read fangirl, and she's the one who encouraged me to write in with this tale. Now don't worry, she won't mind that I've included the personal little bit about her. She's proofreading and approving the whole thing, by the way. Now this incident happened when I was 19. I've taken a year out after high school before going to college so I could work and put together some savings to avoid my student loans from being sky high. It didn't really work, but at least I tried. Now this was back in I think maybe 2012 when Facebook was still really popular. We had a local neighborhood watch. I wasn't really a member as such. I didn't go to meetings or get involved, but I was their honorary mascot, which meant that I was a member of the Facebook group. Now one day, I logged on to find the group totally abuzz. A whole bunch of the neighbors had witnessed something straight out of a horror movie, apparently. As the previous night, an elderly woman had been walking up and down the street, pushing an industrial-style shopping cart. No harm done, right? Well, the shopping cart contained a full-sized coffin. And she wasn't just walking down the street once. She was walking down the street, disappearing for a while, and then walking back the way she came. One of the neighbors, a night owl guy that I knew, his name was James, decided to follow her at a distance. He discovered that she had been walking in a circle around a few blocks and then turning around at a certain point and repeating the circuit in reverse. Everyone's posts were rife with speculation. Why was she carting a coffin around? Was that even legal? Apparently it looked like a fairly battered, dirty coffin, and some of the theories were wild. Now it took me, a 19-year-old girl, to provide a grounded suggestion. It was a Halloween prop. It was the start of October, so it wasn't out of the ordinary. Now James immediately shot my idea down. I hadn't seen her. Why would this extremely elderly lady be walking a circuit around the block with a spirit Halloween coffin and a shopping cart? That's a good point, James, but had he considered dementia? Maybe the old lady lived on the next street over and she was suffering from sundown syndrome, which causes dementia sufferers to start acting weird right after nightfall. It was as good an explanation as any. But whatever. It had happened, it was over, and I guess we'd never know, I said. But wrong. I was very wrong. And the next night, the old woman was back, walking her little loops, and this time, James called me up. Now, I'm sure he'd been waiting for an excuse to call me. The guy actually did have a crush on me since middle school, and he told me to look out my window. Now, sure enough, the old woman was there, and she was really, really old. I was amazed that she had the strength to push a shopping cart around at all, let alone one with a coffin in it. And she wasn't pushing it slowly either. She was striding around like a woman half her age. Now, one thing I noticed that nobody else had seemed to pick up on was that this coffin really did not look like some Spirit Halloween prop. If so, it was the most realistic prop I'd ever seen, and it looked a lot more like a film or TV prop than anything else. At least it couldn't be a real coffin, could it? Now, this whole fiasco went on for another few days. I was on vacation from work, so I was happy to play night owl for a while, and then, that Sunday night, the elderly woman didn't show up. I breathed a sigh of relief, and perhaps this was the end of it. No. The next day, Monday, she was back, and I couldn't help but notice that the coffin was starting to look a little worse for the wear. It had been raining almost constantly for a week, mostly some light rain, but heavier in the daytime, and I wondered if she'd been storing the coffin outside because it certainly looked like the wood was starting to get mold and splinter a little bit. Tuesday came and went, and I saw her again. Now the old woman was starting to fall apart. I really started to pay attention to her appearance. She looked almost confused and scared. Her gait, which had been strong to start with, was really starting to falter, and I was beginning to be more and more convinced that this was dementia. Now, the rest of the neighborhood watch seemed hesitant to get involved, even James. I think he even spooked them out a little. When I kept insisting that we should do something, the adults kept telling me to leave it. She wasn't doing any harm, and there must be a good explanation for it. Now, a far cry from the first night, which had set the whole of the neighborhood watch abuzz. On Wednesday, the woman was really struggling. I'd become used to her role by now, and by my reckoning, it was taking her about twice as long to do her route. Now, on Thursday, she was struggling even further because one of the wheels on her shopping cart had gone all gimpy, and she really had to struggle to keep it straight. On Friday night, I decided I was going to go outside and actually approach her. Now, my parents were away for the weekend. I didn't tell anyone about what I was going to do, as she was an elderly woman who must have been in at least her mid-80s. What was the worst she could do? And so I left my house shortly before I knew that she'd show up and pretended I was outside having a smoke, and I bumped into her by complete accident. It was very clear to me that she was confused. She kept calling me Gloria, which isn't even slightly my name, but eventually I managed to persuade her to open up, and the story she told me was heartbreaking and tragic. The old woman used to live somewhere around here with her husband many years ago. He passed sometime in the 80s, and they'd frequently gone for evening walks around the block, and she had it in her mind that if she started taking those long walks again, she might be able to reconnect with him. At first, her story brought me to tears. The whole thing was so tragic, and she reminded me much of my great-grandma, who had succumbed to Alzheimer's when I was younger, and I wanted to hug the old woman, who told me her name was Ethel, but it felt like it'd be intrusive. Now, I was so focused on the story that she told me that I almost forgot about the coffin itself, and suddenly it struck me. She was walking the neighborhood to reconnect with her husband, but she was carting this coffin around. It couldn't be, could it? I allowed myself to actually look at the coffin. Now, I'd been avoiding looking the whole time, as I suspected that the wood had started rotting in places, and there were a couple of holes in the coffin lid that had led me into the interior. Thankfully, I couldn't see much, but I could see enough. There definitely was some type of bones in that coffin. My hands started shaking, and I told Ethel to wait where she was because I wanted to help her, and then I stepped away a little, called 911, and whispered to the dispatch about what was happening. I told them that if they send the cops, please don't send them with sirens because she was a very old, vulnerable woman, and I didn't want to give her a heart attack or anything. However, it wasn't Ethel who risked having a heart attack. When I turned back to comfort her, I was absolutely horrified to see that she had opened the coffin. Years in the ground had not done her husband justice. It was mostly bones, with patches of shriveled skin in places. His clothes had all rotted off, and one thing that stuck with me was that his scalp was partially intact, and strands of hair hung down one side of his skeletal face. I almost screamed then and ran, but I didn't want to startle Ethel. She seemed so proud to be showing off her husband, as if opening the coffin to show me had suddenly reunited her with her beloved. It's very strange. this feeling of terror and revulsion and grief and sympathy all at once, but I can safely say that I've experienced that combination. I talked to Ethel for a few minutes, trying to keep my eyes off the corpse next to us, which holy hell did it reek. When the cops pulled in, without the sirens on as I requested, and I was unbelievably relieved. Everything was quiet, controlled chaos after that. They took poor Ethel away in a police car and she stayed fully silent. They called a coroner to come for the coffin and the body, and meanwhile, it all suddenly hit me and I started shivering and convulsing in shock, so I was actually carted off to a hospital eventually. It turned out that Ethel's husband's coffin had been stolen 5 years ago. Ethel was 93 at the time that I met her. It was very clear to all of us that an 88-year-old woman was not capable of exhuming a coffin and transporting it out of a graveyard. Whoever helped her has, as far as I'm aware, still never been identified. Ethel fell into a catatonic state immediately following the events. She spent some months in a nursing home, during which I visited her at least twice a week. Now, eventually pneumonia took her, and I hope she's finally reunited with her husband, who I found out was named Clive. Thankfully, I was able to find some photos of him with Ethel in her room that her granddaughter had brought for her, and it was much better a way to picture Clive than the rotting, decomposing corpse he'd been when we first met. Now, I don't think I'll ever get that sight out of my head. It was horrific, tragic, and a terrifying series of events. But it did make for one heck of a story for the Neighborhood Watch Facebook group. Do you like fire, Joel? I used to. I used to enjoy bonfires and campfires. I used to love staring into the flames and imagining I could see all kinds of magical things in them. Now, fire just fills me with fear. Not just because of one event, but because of two. They occurred a few months apart, but they are almost certainly linked. The first event happened when I was walking home from town one day. I live within walking distance of the shopping district. Yay for the UK and its tiny landmass, so walking into town was a weekly trip for me. I live in a no-through terrace street with footpaths on one end. One leads from the town/train station, and the other leads to the suburbs and further out of town. I was walking down the footpath leading to my street when I noticed a group of 3 very drunk, very loud people just ahead of me. 2 men and a woman. I could hear them over the sounds of Rammstein playing through my headphones, but I shut off my iPhone so I could hear them clearer. They were some of the most vulgar, unpleasant people I have ever had the misfortune to follow, and I prayed that they didn't stop, turn around, and see me. They were clearly 50,000 sheets to the wind, and from the sounds of their jabbering, they were looking for a fight with someone. Anyone, probably. Thankfully, they were too focused on heading to wherever to stop and turn around. As I reached the turning into my street, they crossed over to the next footpath. I watched with disgust as one of them tossed a cigarette butt into the hedge of my neighbor at the end of the street. And as soon as I got home and unpacked my shopping, I headed upstairs and checked out the window. I was a little concerned about the discarded cigarette butt because it was a dry summer and the hedge had started turning brown and dry. And before I even had a chance to scope out the end of the street, I knew something was up. It looked like it was snowing, in August, and I quickly realized that ash was blowing past my window. I quickly looked out to the right and saw that flames were licking up my neighbor's hedge. I grabbed my phone and called a couple of neighbors, ones that I knew were members of the Neighborhood Watch, and then I immediately ran outside. Before I even had a chance to get halfway down the street, the entire hedge, and I'm talking an extremely large, deciduous hedge here, had caught fully ablaze. Other neighbors started emerging from their houses, and we felt helpless as we realized that there was pretty much no way to get any kind of water towards the hedge. A bunch of us had called the fire brigade, but we had to watch in horror as the fire spread across the garden and caused the large tree in the center of my neighbor's front garden to suddenly erupt into flames. Now, it seemed like it took mere seconds for the tree to turn into a smoldering, blackened trunk and dead branches. Thankfully, that killed this part of the fire, but there was still the hedge to contend with, and with the danger of the fire spreading to the house. Thankfully, the fire brigade got there and managed to control the blaze. Once things had calmed down, I drew one of the firemen aside and told him about the trio that I'd seen tossing a potentially lit cigarette butt into the hedge, as it was clear that this had caused the fire. Now, to my surprise, the fireman seemed completely disinterested. In fact, he acted like I was an annoyance or like he didn't believe me. And this really infuriated me, because I guess I was a younger person at the time, and obviously young people, and when I say young, I mean mid-20s, apparently can't be taken seriously. And this event is what caused me to finally, properly join the neighborhood watch. I did pretty well in my first few months as a fully fledged member. I recruited other neighbors and persuaded them to join. As someone who often works nights, I kept an eye out and was able to scare off at least one or two potential vehicle vandals. I saw a guy dealing weed on the corner a few times, but I'm not that much of a narc, so I let that one be. And then, one night, I was up very late playing video games on the computer in my room at the back of the house. Now, I forget what I was playing, but it must have been something quiet because, despite wearing headphones, I was able to hear what sounded like fireworks coming from outside. Now, it wasn't remotely fireworks season, and when I heard a second bang, I realized that it sounded more like a gunshot than a firework, but not quite that either. I climbed over my bed and peered out the window. A disturbing orange glow was coming from the back garden of one of the houses on my side of the street, right at the end. Now, at first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing until I heard another explosion and a pillar of flame shot up into the air. Immediately, I called the fire brigade and then the leader of the neighborhood watch. I still wasn't sure which garden was on fire. My friends live at the penultimate house in the terrace, and I was worried it was their garden. I ran outside and was surprised to discover I was alone. The first thing I did was run to the end of the street, and that's when I realized that it was the side garden of the final house in the row, number 20, which was on fire. And from what I could tell, it was the garden shed, but the flames were licking dangerously towards the house itself, which was pretty dilapidated and, in particular, had a wooden balcony which could easily catch fire. I ran straight to number 19 and knocked, waking them up, and started yelling that the next door was on fire and it could spread to their house and they needed to get out of there right away. Now, as soon as I left number 19 with the family in tow, I was met by other neighbors who had also heard the commotion. A few of us had already called the fire brigade at the same time, and we were assured that they were on their way. I looked around, and I could not see the guy who lived in number 20. I assumed that he would have been first to evacuate, but no. Entering his garden was impossible, as he had a big wooden gate which was locked and would have been too slow to climb over. So in my infinite wisdom, I decided to head down the footpath that headed into town and try and yell for the guy who lived there, and also his cat, who I was very fond of. I took a few steps down from the footpath when suddenly there was another explosion from the shed. A huge, billowing wall of flame rolled over the wall and came thundering towards me, and the fire got so close to me that it singed my eyebrows and the hairs on my arms. I jumped backwards. If I had taken one single step forwards, I would have been hit by that wall of flame. Now, I'm certain that someone was looking out for me that day because I was so close to being immolated that, damn, it's honestly scary to even think about to this day. Now, the first brigade showed up and then the cops. And when the fire was put out and all the commotion had died down and some time had passed, we eventually discovered through our neighborhood watch liaison that it had been an act of arson. Someone had set the neighbor's shed on fire. Unfortunately, the neighbor had been storing a whole bunch of aerosol cans and fuel in his shed, which he really wasn't supposed to do, which had led to the fire being far more serious than was likely intended and far more dangerous. The reason that the owner hadn't fled the house was because he was actually away, staying with his son up country, and you'll be pleased to know that the cat was fine and was the first to flee. Now, I can't be sure, but I'm absolutely certain that the trio who set the fire to the hedge were also the ones who burned the shed. When they'd been walking past number 20, some of their vulgarity had been directed at the man who lived there in the house, so they clearly knew him, and there was a nearby pub which had CCTV cameras, and of course it wasn't working at the time, so nobody was identified. The arsonist or arsonists were never caught, but I know who it was. It was the drunk alcoholic smokers who recklessly threw burning cigarette butts around. And so just after our street had stopped stinking of a burning hedge, it started stinking of a burning shed. That was a fun year, with the smell of burning everything permeating our lives. At least nothing else had caught fire for nearly 2 decades now, and if it does, then I'm going to leave it up to other members of the neighborhood watch to go heroically diving into those flames. I don't recommend it, and I think I exhausted my luck when I almost caught on fire the first time. But if I'm ever forced to save a cat from the flames, I can't promise I won't dive into that inferno again. I lived with my family on Redacted Street for a few years. It was a close-knit, lovely community full of diversity and friendship, and a whole bunch of us became fast friends, and we'd regularly host barbecues and get-togethers at each other's places. The guys, me included, would often watch football regularly, and we'd generally just have a good time. And that's why it made total sense to set up a neighborhood watch. It seemed like fun at first. The neighborhood was extremely safe, and there wasn't much to really watch out for. But a bunch of us hot-blooded guys thought that it would be a badass idea, and so we went about filing the correct paperwork and completing the correct registrations. And soon, every house had one of those neighborhood watch stickers in their window, and we had a menacing sign attached to a lamppost at the opening of the street. Now, I was very impressed that absolutely everyone in the community signed up. Not surprised really, but still. Of course, nothing happened for a while. We set up a neighborhood watch email group and tested it by using it mostly for group chats. Sometimes we'd do tests. One of us would alert the others that they were going to fake an emergency, and then we would, just to test our reaction times. It was completely silly and really achieved nothing, but it was fun. And that's why I didn't take it entirely seriously when I got Mike's email to the group. Mike was the elected head of this neighborhood watch, and he was a bit of a joker. He was a serious, dependable guy when it came to it, but he was always down for a laugh. His email read like he'd either forgotten to warn us that this was a test or that he figured it was so silly he didn't even need to warn us. Now, I've still got the email archived in my old Hotmail account, and here I'll just read it for you. I've tried to fix its many typos, but Mike wasn't the best at grammar. It read as follows. Guys, there's been a sighting of something effing weird in the neighborhood. I heard from Mrs. O'Bannon and Miss Perks via 2 separate emails that they'd seen an old, withered, dirty-looking homeless guy walking down the middle of the road. Now, okay, we don't judge. Homeless people are allowed to cut through our area. That wasn't the issue, though. The guy was walking a pet on a leash, a pet alligator, according to Mrs. O'Bannon, and a crocodile, according to Miss Perks. Now, they're both willing to admit that as old ladies, they don't have the best eyesight, but they are certain that this is what they saw. Now, as you all know, we live absolutely nowhere near alligator country, and I believe crocodiles only live maybe somewhere south of Florida when it comes to mainland America, so I have no idea how this man would have a pet alligator/crocodile. Either way, be careful out there. You don't want to find yourself as reptile chow. Regards, Mike. Now, immediately, I was on the phone to Mike asking if this was some kind of goof. Now, I could instantly tell that he was serious. He was skeptical, sure, like he'd said. The old ladies didn't have the best eyesight. But what other animal could they have mistaken for a crocodile or alligator? Mike and I tried to come up with some alternatives. A huge, crawling dog? Now, that hardly seemed likely. A Komodo dragon? Now, that would have been even worse, really. A snake? That's still not great. And after that, we were out of ideas. We knew one thing, though. The neighborhood watch had to be extra vigilant at night until we were sure that we'd seen the last of Crocodile Bum D, as we took to calling him. A pun on the movie character Crocodile Dundee for you youngsters out there. You should watch it, though. Thankfully, my kids were both at summer camp for the next month, and my wife was currently working nights at the hospital. So I was being a bit of a night owl myself to make sure that I got to spend some time with the love of my life instead of missing each other like the ships in the night. And I told Mike that I'd keep an eye out. Unsurprisingly, I saw absolutely no sign of any reptile-walking homeless guy. I did see a disheveled figure staggering down the street at 3 a.m. one night, but soon realized that it was the Petersons' teenage son, clearly drunk and clearly sneaking home. Now, I'm pretty sure he wasn't supposed to be underage drinking, but I didn't report him though. I'm not some snitch. Now, the next night was actually a full moon. It was a beautiful night, warm without being oppressive, and the kind of night that you really didn't want to stay stuck inside on the computer. I'd been neglecting my morning jogs to make sure that I was home to greet my wife, so I decided that at 1 a.m., that was a decent enough time to go quietly jogging around the neighborhood. Everyone knew I was on Crocodile Bum D watch duty, so I figured I wouldn't alarm anyone with my presence jogging around. Now, I've been jogging around for about 10-15 minutes, cursing my dad bod and feeling frustrated at the fact that I'd let myself go a little. I took a break to sort of bend down and control my breathing, and you know the way that joggers do where you rest your hands on your thighs? Well, feeling invigorated, I looked up and immediately saw a figure at the far end of the street. I was standing in the shadow of a tree, so I don't think he saw me at the time, and I watched him for a moment and then realized with horror that it was the infamous Crocodile Bum D. The old ladies that warned us about him had not done him justice. He was an absolute mountain of a man. I could see him pretty clearly because he was strolling down the road in the middle of it, lit up by streetlights on either side. And he wore this huge, filthy coat that was even taller than him, with a hem dragging along the surface of the road. And he wore these huge black boots, and I could hear his stomping footsteps even from over 200 yards away. Now, he had long, straggly hair and a wild-looking beard. I couldn't tell what race he was because of how much hair he had covering his head and face. And in between his footsteps, I heard a scraping and a sort of scuttling too. Now, I must have seen it already, but my mind had refused to process it. The man was, as the women had said, was walking an alligator on a leash. If it hadn't been for the full moon and the streetlights, it would have been hard to see the creature in the dark. It was almost black, just sort of scraping along the street on a long leash, some distance from its menacing walker. Now, a lot of the following information I learned after the fact, but I'll just fill you in now. While the alligator looked intimidatingly big to me, it turned out to be a juvenile American alligator. And trust me, the fact that it was juvenile and was only about half its full size was a blessing. Those things can grow on average to 12 feet in length. Apparently, this one was set to be on the bigger scale, maybe as long as 14 feet, and I think I might have dropped dead of a heart attack if I was faced with a 14-foot alligator in the middle of my street in the middle of the night. Not that a 7 or 8-foot alligator was really much better, as I was just frozen there, hiding in the shadow of the tree, completely unsure of what to do or say. Now, I knew it was my duty to do something as the designated neighborhood watch reptile hunter, but holy crap, what could I do? I was not approaching that thing. But suddenly I had a stroke of genius. When we'd set up that neighborhood watch, a police liaison officer had come to talk to us about the do's and don'ts. He gave us advice on how to operate so we didn't become an armed militia, you know the things. Now, one thing he did mention is that our state, and specifically our area of the state, had adopted a fairly new system. This system basically meant that you could text to 911 instead of calling. It's a lot more common across the states now, but back when this took place, we were one of the first states to adopt it. Go North Dakota. Now, naturally, I was concerned about calling 911 and alerting Crocodile Bum D, who was starting to look more threatening than the name suggested. I quickly slipped behind some tree, pulled out my creaky old smartphone out of my jogging fanny pack, and fired off a quick text to 911. Now, I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something frantic and silly like, "Giant man with an alligator walking down redacted street. Alligator is big. Man is bigger. Send help." Thankfully, as a registered member of the neighborhood watch, Mike's deputy no less, I was known to the local cops, so I figured that they wouldn't dismiss me as some prankster. Now, I was also hoping that maybe they would have received other reports about this guy, and he must have come from somewhere. I decided to wait behind the tree for Alligator Man to pass or for the cops to show up. Unfortunately, my plan did not work out. A few moments after texting 911, I heard a sound that I swear echoes through my nightmares. Now, if you've never heard the sound of an alligator before, then lucky you. I've included a YouTube Shorts link because in case Joel wants to play the sound to illustrate exactly what I heard, but you can look it up. If you didn't play the audio or you can't hear it, then it sounds like a dragon growling. Now tell me that doesn't sound like a freaking dragon. That's what I heard that night. Now, I know in retrospect that this sound isn't actually an alligator even being aggressive, it's just the sound that they make to be curious or on alert. But in the middle of the night, as the creature and the man got closer than I realized, hearing that nearly made me poop my jogging shorts. I'm sorry for the image, but it's true. And then I heard the huge man rasp in the deepest voice I've ever heard, asking his alligator friend what she heard. Now, I'm pretty sure that he already knew he was there because he was saying things like, "Are we being watched, Princess? Is there someone up ahead, Princess, maybe behind that tree?" Now, my first thought was, no way. The alligator's called Princess. Now, my second thought was, I can't just keep staying hiding here. At the time, I had no idea how fast alligators really were, and I had no idea if this monster of a man was going to release Princess to chase me down if I ran. And so I did the bravest thing I could. I stepped out from behind the tree, greeted the man as cheerily as I could, and told him that I'd just been out for a late-night jog and was taking a breather. The man grunted at me in response, and Princess let out another one of those menacing bellows. Now, I knew I couldn't just say, "Nice to meet you, bye, I'm off to bed now." I didn't want Alligator Man to see where I lived, for starters, and so I decided to try and strike up a conversation with him. "So, taking your gator for a walk, huh?" And the man grunted again in response. I started to ask some questions about her, like where he'd gotten her, clearly somewhere illegal, what her name was, Princess, I already knew that, all that sort of crap. And then I heard both the most blissful and terrible sound I could hear. Sirens in the distance and getting closer. The monster of a man looked at me, and the anger on his hairy, filthy face was impossible to ignore. He grunted out something accusing me of calling the cops on him, and then called Princess to his side. He began to kneel, no mean feat at his size, and I realized with horror that he was moving to unleash Princess. "Princess don't like loud noises," he said. I did not stick around to see whether he actually did unleash Princess or not. I turned tail and sprinted back to my house, which was almost the entire length of the street, and I had never ran that fast before or since. As I fumbled to get my keys into the lock, I was sure that I heard the sounds of the alligator sprinting towards me, although not that I have any idea what an alligator sprinting really sounds like. I managed to finally get my key into the lock and dive inside and kick the door shut. At the same time, I heard the sound of multiple cop cars pulling into my street and my hallway being bathed in flashing lights. I peeked out the window to see a standoff between the officers and that huge man. Thankfully, Princess was on her leash. Maybe she always had been. And it turned out that multiple people had called the cops because a pretty seriously armored animal control duo were also on the scene. One of them was holding one of those devices that let you wrangle an animal around the neck. Now, I couldn't hear exactly what was being said or yelled, but the next series of events was relieving, sure, but it was also one of the most heartbreaking things I had ever seen. I guess the cops managed to persuade the man to let animal control take charge of his alligator, because he knelt down and began to pet her as one of the animal control officers approached and, in his defense, very gently wrangled Princess around the neck. That alligator must have been the most tame alligator in existence, really, because she didn't writhe or wriggle or death roll. Instead, she almost obediently allowed animal control to guide her into the back of their wagon. Meanwhile, this probably 7-foot-tall monster of a man meekly allowed the cops to handcuff him and guide him into one of their cars. I watched as they drove off. He could barely sit up straight in the back of the cop car, he was so tall. And so this had gone from the scariest, most effed up night of my life to something that left me conflicted and kind of sad. I'm a bit of a softie when it comes to animals, and even though this massively intimidating man had an illegal, lethally dangerous pet and was taking her for a walk down my street, I couldn't help but feel bad. I guess in his eyes, Princess was no different than a dog or the many legal, dangerous exotic pets that people can keep. On the other hand, I was the absolute hero of the neighborhood watch when I told them everything that had happened. We had a meeting the next day over beers and snacks, and I was definitely the man of the hour. I still had this nagging sadness for Princess and Crocodile Bum D, though. Thankfully, I was able to get some updates on the story over the years, and the man, whose name actually was Warren, was indeed in possession of an illegal juvenile alligator. However, as he was able to prove, he'd found her as a baby, abandoned by whoever had originally purchased her as a pet. The two had bonded, and he'd looked after her ever since. He admitted to the cops that he had no idea how large she'd grow, but accepted that she was clearly growing too big for him to manage. Princess, for the most part, had never harmed anyone or committed any crimes. Given the circumstances, nobody involved wanted to euthanize the animal, and eventually an animal sanctuary not too far away was found. The sanctuary had both the means to look after an alligator and a spare space to nurture one who hadn't acclimatized to other members of her species. Now, not only that, it was discovered that Warren had previously worked as a zookeeper many years ago, and while he'd been living homeless and unemployed for some time, he had the necessary qualifications and free time and the ability to relocate. So Princess and Warren went to live and work at the animal sanctuary together. Unfortunately, Warren passed away a couple of years ago due to cancer, but I occasionally exchange emails with the owner of the animal sanctuary, and Princess is doing extremely well. In captivity, she's looking at a good 50 or 60 more years of life, and I know that wherever he is now, Warren is looking down, watching over her. I used to be part of a neighborhood watch group, and I was witness to an absolutely crazy, kind of creepy incident that sticks with me to this day. We live on a street just on the outskirts of a small town which has a higher than average crime rate. Our street itself has always been pretty lucky, avoiding being the focus of the town's worst offenders. There was the occasional attempted break-in, some power tools stolen from a few garden sheds, but that was really it. Now, that was before this spate of car vandalism. Almost every morning, we'd wake up to discover one of our cars had been keyed or the mirrors had been slashed off. Now, in a couple of cases, the badges on the front of the couple of cars have been stolen. Now, this was back when that was a lot easier to do. One of the neighbors owned a Mercedes, and I swear his badge must have been stolen 3 times over the course of a year or so, even after we put a stop to the worst of the vandalism. Now, the vandalism is what spurred us on to start taking the neighborhood watch duties seriously. We spoke to local law enforcement, asked for the best tips we could, befriended a community officer, and got a direct line to the local station. And they also agreed to send a patrol into our cul-de-sac as many nights as possible. Now, not to belittle our boys in blue, but I don't think I ever actually saw a cop patrolling our street. I guess in fairness, they did have better things to do, like preventing murders and violent stuff in the city, so it's not like I hold it against them. And that's what the neighborhood watch was for anyway. The vandalism continued though, so about 5 or 6 of us guys volunteered to take night duty until the vandal was caught. Now surely, if we spent the next night watching the small cul-de-sac, we'd catch that person or multiple people in the act. Now that's what you'd think anyway, and yet somehow after a couple of weeks of vigilance, we didn't spot a single suspicious character. And yet the vandalism continued. It was like the culprit was Spec Ops or a ghost or something crazy. But what kind of Spec Ops soldier spends his time army crawling along the ground keying cars? I wish I could offer an explanation of who did it and how, but that was still something we never discovered. Instead, this vandalizer decided to retire himself and go out with a bang. There had been a car parked at the end of our cul-de-sac for what seemed like forever. It had clearly been abandoned there, and a number of us neighborhood watch members had stuck flyers all over the car, pleading with the owner to just move along. All the tires had deflated by this point naturally, and the paintwork was incredibly rusty. Now, we called the city council about it multiple times, but nothing was ever done. In the end, it just became sort of a staple of the street. We called the car Christine, after the Stephen King story, because it had the vague air of being haunted, or at least kind of sinister. Now one night, it was my turn on night watch, and I was just working on my laptop looking out the window when I noticed a glow coming from the end of the cul-de-sac. My house was in the middle, so I had to look around to see exactly what it was. Immediately, I realized Christine was on fire from the inside. I ran outside, careful not to get too close, and these flames were just picking up inside of Christine's seats, but I couldn't immediately see a broken window or any way that the fire could have actually been started inside the car. I called the cops on my cell phone, so I'm glad I paused to do so because moments later, Christine exploded outward. It wasn't the kind of huge epic explosion you might see in the movies or expect from Call of Duty or something. I guess in part this was because the car had been sitting there for so long without any gas that there wasn't too much fuel to actually explode. It was enough to send pieces of shrapnel flying into the road or pieces of glass into the car parked near Christine, though, and it would certainly have been strong enough to cause me some serious damage if I'd actually approached like I had planned to. And soon the cops showed up, as did the fire department, and the vehicle's blaze was extinguished. Over the next few days, we learned that the fire had definitely been arson. A small hole had been drilled through the glass of one of Christine's windows, a tiny bit of accelerant had been poured through it, and then someone had fed a burning rag into the car. Now finally, the cops and the city council put up some effort into tracking Christine's owner, and this went absolutely nowhere. As it turned out, the license plate was just completely fake, registered to no vehicle on record, and the only thing they were able to trace was the engine, which belonged to a totally different, much older car that had been supposedly scrapped many years before. Now, there's no way Christine would have been able to drive at all with that engine installed, and the whole thing was just some mystery. Nobody had any idea when the car had turned up or what the purpose of all of it really was. Had the vandalism been some kind of preamble in order to burn Christine for some purpose? Some of us half expected the cops to find a charred body in the trunk, but there was nothing like that. The wreckage of the car got towed, and from that day forward, the vehicular vandalism just kind of stopped. Various other things happened with the neighborhood watch since then. I confronted a burglar, and one of my neighbors helped the cops arrest an SA offender on the run, and we successfully chased off a gang of drug dealers who'd started operating on the corner. But nothing ever came close to being as puzzling and mysterious or creepy as that series of vehicular vandalism and the mysterious Christine, the impossible car. Now, it's been nearly a decade since then, and I still think about it from time to time. At the very least, I wish I knew who had been responsible for the vandalism and how they'd been able to slip under my nose quite so successfully. But I guess some mysteries just never end up getting solved. I'm going to start this by saying that I love the idea of the Neighborhood Watch Initiative. I've moved house since this story took place, and I'm part of an unofficial neighborhood watch myself. I regularly help out, and I'd say that I'm a proud member. Now, it wasn't always the case. I used to live in a small ranch-style house in a relatively rural neighborhood. I didn't know much about the concept of neighborhood watch groups at the time, and even less so about the type of neighborhood watch group in my area. I don't really want to name the group or explain who they were because it'll open up a can of worms, but let's just say that they were a specific type of neighborhood watch group where all the members were of a certain heritage, which I was not, and therefore I was never invited to join or be any part of their group. But within a day of moving in, I did receive a surprisingly professional-looking pamphlet detailing who they were and what they did. In short, they kept an eye on the neighborhood for undesirables, bad behavior, and any threat to their way of life. My vague understanding of a neighborhood watch group was that they were a group of people who kept an eye out for crime or vandalism, but that didn't seem to be the case here. It seemed more like a homeowners association, but they were adamant in their literature that they were a neighborhood watch group. And boy, did they send a lot of literature. Almost every week I received a Neighborhood Watch newsletter, but these mostly consisted of lists of things I should or shouldn't do as a good member of the community. The pamphlets I received seemed specifically designed for people like me, i.e. people who didn't quite fit in to their culture. I don't want to say that they were outright hostile, but they made it very clear that I didn't entirely belong and I wasn't one of them. I had no idea which of my neighbors actually belonged to this Neighborhood Watch group, but almost every neighbor I tried to befriend or even be remotely friendly with seemed to snub me or look down on me. They were all a fair bit older than me, with the youngest pushing 50 aside from a small handful of families who kept to themselves. And there was one neighbor I befriended, though. I'll just call him Devin. Now, he was a black guy who had lived in the neighborhood with his wife until she tragically passed away a couple of years ago. We became buddies, and I soon found out that he'd been made to feel as ostracized by the neighborhood watch as I had. And according to Devin, they'd barely even offered sympathy when his wife had passed. Their biggest concern seemed to be informing him that if he was holding the wake at home, he'd have to limit how many cars parked in the street because otherwise it might become inconvenient for the others. Now, I was horrified at this. The man had just lost his wife, and the neighborhood watch, as they called himself, were concerned that too many people might want to support him and pay their respects. And so we kind of bonded over how much of a bunch of expletives this neighborhood watch group was. Now, we took to calling them the homeowners a-holes. Anytime either of us did end up speaking to one of the members of the neighborhood watch, particularly a very elderly man called Elijah, we intentionally referred to them as a homeowners association after realizing how much they seemed to irrationally anger them. Now, it wasn't long before I started receiving personalized letters on their pretentious customized neighborhood watch letterhead complaining about various things. My lawn needed trimming, my car was parked too far from the curb, and I should only ever park in my driveway, never mind the fact that I was applying new asphalt at the time. Now, I wrote back informing them that this seemed like something an HOA should be concerned with, not a neighborhood watch group, especially one of their persuasion, and shouldn't they be on the lookout for crimes and vandalism? Mike's garden shed had been broken into a few weeks before, and there certainly hadn't been any neighborhood watch keeping an eye then. They didn't respond to this, but 2 weeks later, I received another letter informing me that an untoward-looking gentleman had been seen on my property on multiple evenings. Now, this confused me at first until I realized that they were talking about Mike, their own neighbor. Now, we couldn't outright come out and accuse them of racism because they never specified details of who they were talking about other than saying he appeared suspicious. But it wasn't hard to read between the lines. I think I was angrier about this than Mike was. I guess he was used to the neighbors being kind of hostile, which he said had been going on ever since he and his Iranian wife moved in. As an Iranian guy myself, this made me even more angry for a bunch of reasons, and Mike really had to work hard to calm me down. And that's when he hit me with the news. He was moving out in 3 months. Now, I was kind of mad at him. He was going to leave me with these people who clearly didn't want us here, and that's when he suggested that I sell up and, for the time being, move in with him as his roommate. Now, it felt kind of juvenile, as men in our late 20s and early 30s respectively, but Mike was moving to my dream city, San Francisco, and I had family there. It wasn't actually a bad idea, so it was decided. We'd leave this weird, creepy neighborhood watch cult in our rearview mirror and move out. And that's when things got really crazy. I started receiving notes, again on the neighborhood watch letterheads, and this time they were accusing me of running a meth lab in the basement. At first, that's all they were, statements and accusations. And then they escalated. I could call the cops and shut you down, but I won't. Not yet. That kind of thing. And then next, I received an ultimatum telling me to shut the meth lab down or something terrible would happen. Now, this was all insane. Obviously, I was not running a meth lab in my basement, and the biggest piece of evidence in my defense was that I did not even have a basement. I guess some of the other houses in the spread-out neighborhood did, and whoever was accusing me of this was one of those basement owners. Presumably he, or she, assumed my house was just the same. I showed Mike, and what started off as a kind of joke soon turned pretty scary. We were counting down the days until the move, just 6 weeks now. And that's when I got the most terrifying letter yet. Still written on neighborhood watch letterhead paper, and the writing was scrawled, erratic, and somewhat mental. The writer threatened that if I didn't shut my meth lab down within a week, which I was clearly running with a friend, who the author identified with a slur that I won't repeat here, then both of our houses were going to be cleansed by holy fire, quote-unquote. Mike and I debated whether this was a metaphor or something more. Our question was answered when the hedge bordering my front yard was set ablaze in the middle of the night. The next morning, after a sleepless night and some wonderful aid from the fire department, I was met with another insane note claiming that this was a taste of what we were to expect. Now, obviously, I informed the cops at this point. They took all the notes for evidence just in case they could find any trace fingerprints, and I made photocopies before the cops took them and decided enough was enough. I was going to confront the leader of the neighborhood watch, a man I'd thus far completely avoided, and his name is Samuel. Now, with Mike as backup, we went storming over to Samuel's house. Now, the wind was knocked out of our sails a little when the door was answered by his adorable daughter who invited us in. And then, Samuel's wife offered us hot drinks and cookies, and it was like cultural whiplash. Eventually, Samuel arrived home from his round of golf and sent the family away. We confronted him with the letters, angrily thrusting them right at his face, and we hit him with everything. How the neighbors had made us all feel unwelcome, how this kind of insanity was not the type of thing a neighborhood watch should be engaging in, and we asked if the organization was even registered with the local police or officials in any way. All the while, Samuel was just sitting there, quietly taking in our rage as he read over the notes. And when he was done, he looked at us with a face as pale as a ghost, and to his credit, he admitted that he and the neighbors had felt like myself, Mike, and his wife had not been the best fit for the neighborhood. He admitted that the pamphlets we were sent were intentionally hostile, that there were a number of neighbors, particularly the old folks, who like to keep things culturally insular. Now, I'd just like to reiterate at this point that this wasn't a regular sort of white thing. It wasn't even just a group of white people just trying to drive us out. It was a lot more complex than that, but I don't want to go into the whole story here due to the current events. I'll just leave it up to you to decide what I'm talking about, but it wasn't a case of random white people acting hostile towards BIPOC folk. It was weirder than that, which is all I'll say on the matter. Now back to Samuel. He swore blind on his faith and his family that he had no knowledge of these handwritten, threatening notes and had no idea who sent them. I believed him. He'd been so bluntly honest with us to that point that I had no reason not to. Now, Mike was less convinced, but I managed to persuade him. The one thing that did disturb us both was when Samuel said he had an idea and that both Mike and I should be very, very careful. He asked if there was any way we could escalate our move. When we told him there wasn't and that we were locked in for the next 6 weeks, Samuel told us to leave everything with him. Remember the old man Elijah who I mentioned earlier? Well, he died of a heart attack 3 days after we confronted Samuel, and the note stopped. The neighbors started being more friendly towards us, so much so in fact that some of them went out of their way to bring Mike and I these delicious food dishes, and Samuel invited us for dinner multiple times. Mike was still suspicious and didn't accept invites, but I at least tried to play nice with Samuel. Mostly I was curious to dig into what might have happened with Elijah. Samuel never let anything slip. He was a very slippery, intelligent character, but he dropped enough hints for me to know that Elijah had been the one sending the notes and that maybe, just maybe, his little heart attack had been a lot more convenient than coincidental. All in all, it was like living in Twin Peaks or the Twilight Zone. I was extremely happy to get out of there with Mike. Now, I stayed with him for around 6 months before moving into a place of my own with a wonderful woman that I met in Frisco, who I'm now proud to call my wife. We live in the city, and Mike lives nearby, and there's absolutely no official neighborhood watch to speak of. We all just look out for each other and act like good neighbors to each other. And that's all you need, really. The rest can work under the right circumstances, but when a group of people like our former neighborhood watch get together, there's a danger that it can spawn folks like Elijah who take things way too far, or people like Samuel who in many ways were the most chilling characters of them all, even if his actions might have saved us in the end. Frankly, I just don't want to meet any of them again or any of their ilk. I'm pretty happy with my diverse melting pot of city neighbors, thank you very much. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com. and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, go to San Francisco to get yourself a poop needle. On today's episode, you'll hear 3 disturbing roommate stories. One man is forced to spy on his housemate for dangerous criminals. Another discovers his roommate's disturbing obsession with things that'll leave your stomach churning. And one tenant begins waking up in the middle of the night to his sleepwalking roommate whose escalating behavior becomes too much to handle. Hear all of these terrifying tales right now, only on Let's Read. Hey Joel, my name's Phil and I grew up in Tacoma, Washington in the 80s and 90s. Now, I didn't do great in school, so I dropped out when I was 17 and got a job working in a bar to get myself some money. I stuck around for about 6 years learning all the tricks of the trade, and then by 2006, I was practically running the place under the guidance of the old owner/manager. That place was my meal ticket, so I ran a tight ship, and if you ask me, we had the best bar in South Tacoma. Well, it turns out someone else thought so too, and that someone ended up making me a job offer I couldn't refuse. It's not there anymore, but there was this restaurant in South Lake Union called Gastropod, and the guy I served drinks to that night was the owner, and he wanted me to be the place's new general manager once the current one turned over his keys at the end of the month, and he was willing to pay me very handsomely for my services. I said thank you and goodbye to the old crew, moved up to Seattle towards the end of the month, and then spent the next few works getting over the imposter syndrome as I settled into my new role. Now, I love my job, but the best thing about moving up to Seattle by far was my new apartment. Aside from the steep rent, there was basically no downsides to living there. It was a really nice neighborhood, and when I say it was quiet, I mean it was crazy just how peaceful it was. And that was in no small part down to my roommate, named Adam. And Adam was, in a word, a ghost. It actually took a whole 3 weeks after moving in before I met him, and I tried knocking on his door down in the lobby a whole 3 times and got no answer every single time. I was just getting home from work around 11:30 at night when I ran into Adam in the lobby while he was headed out. And the dude looked legitimately spooked to see me at first, and then even after I introduced myself as his new neighbor, he didn't seem to warm up at all. He wasn't rude really, just anxious. And after he said he worked in tech, I invited him up for a beer sometime, and he replied very nervously saying, "Yeah, sure, maybe," in a way that suggested that he was never going to do that. But hey, there are worse things than a quiet roommate, right? So I wasn't really complaining. And I lived in Seattle for a whole 6 months without anything to complain about, besides the rain, of course. Until one day, when my awesome brand new life turned into a complete nightmare. It started towards the end of March 2007. I finished up at work, said goodbye to everyone, and locked up for the night, and then as I was walking along waiting for a vacant cab to appear, a black sedan with tinted windows rolled up next to me. I could spend like a paragraph or two describing the guy who appeared in the open back window, but nothing really sums him up better than Fat Bill Burr. He was bald like Bill, he talked like Bill, and he even laughed like Bill, and the only difference was the guy in the back seat must have had at least 60 pounds on him. In this loud Boston accent, he says to me, "Hey buddy, how's it going?" I told him fine, that I was on my way home, and then he says, "Well, why don't you jump in? I'll give you a ride." I told the guy that I'd rather wait for a cab, and then he responds, "You're the manager of that gastropod place, right?" When I said yes, he told me that that was what he wanted to talk to me about, and if I got into his car and went for a ride with him, I might just find myself looking at a very lucrative money-making opportunity, both for me and the restaurant. I hesitated, but he gave me this look and said, come on. What do you think I'm gonna do? Just get in, and even if it's a no on what I gotta say, you got yourself a free ride home. Now, I wasn't some nerd incapable of defending myself, so I got in, and we took off, and I listened to what he had to say. But from the moment he started talking, I knew that I'd made a huge mistake. Now, the first thing he said was basically, all right, I'm gonna come clean. I don't give a crap about your crummy job, but you're in the car now, so shut up and listen. The guy's demeanor shifted completely after I got in the car, and I can't lie. It definitely made me a little nervous when he forcibly told me to shut up. And it wasn't just him and a driver either. There was a guy in the passenger seat looking around and very much mean-mugging me. And the guy started off by saying that since he knew where I lived and he knew where I worked, we'd be seeing plenty of each other in the future. And there was no point hiding or any of that crap, as he put it. But if I kept cool and did my job, then, like he said, there was money in it for me. All I had to do was find a way of getting into my roommate's part of the house so I could look for something for him. It was real small, and so small that he might be able to hide it in some pretty creative places, so I'd have to look long and hard if I wanted to find it. But when I did find it, the guy didn't want me to take it. He just wanted me to let him know that it was there and, more importantly, where it was being hidden. Now, I remember kind of reflexively saying, I can't do that, to which he responded that not only could I do what he asked, but I would. He said I didn't look stupid, so he knew I'd do the right thing and do as he asked. I asked what would happen if I didn't, and the implications were clear. He said I'd recognize the thing he wanted me to find from the letters D-FNTL written on it. I didn't have to memorize it, though. I don't even think it was those exact letters either, to be honest, but it'd be the only thing in his place with those letters on it, and then when I found it, all I had to do was tell him it was there. He left a kind of pause, waiting for me to say something, but all I could bring myself to ask was if he was, like, with the CIA or the FBI or something. The guy laughed and then told me if he was, he'd just arrest me and throw my ass in a cell, then threaten me with prison time till I cooperated. But since he wasn't, since he was a nice guy, as he put it, he was going to pay me to do it instead. On the other hand, he could make a phone call to some associates of his who'd head over to my place in the middle of the night and beat the location of the object out of my roommate. But he knew that it'd be noisy and messy and have the cops crawling around, and since I probably had my own stuff going on, I most likely didn't want that. Just to make it clear, I did not have my own stuff going on, and I'd have been more than happy to have gotten the cops involved there and then. But he had that whole thing covered with the next part of his little speech. He said the cops in Seattle were dumb and couldn't run a goddamn bath, let alone a city. And they were also more corrupt than an NBA ref, at least according to him anyway. And so if I talked to them and made any kind of report about him or what was going on with my roommate, he'd know, and there'd be trouble. Now by this point, I'm just a complete mess in my head, and all my energy was going towards not showing that. My head was spinning, I can feel myself sweating, and at one point I was legitimately thinking, this can't be happening. I passed out on the pavement and this freaking fever dream is occurring right now. But it wasn't. What was occurring to me in that moment was real, and there was no getting out of it. The guy even picked up on how scared I was after he directed his driver to take me home, and he started saying how I didn't have to worry about a thing if I just did as he told me. And there was no time limit on it either, since my priority was almost not alerting my roommate that I was going through his stuff. And the guy said if I spooked him, he might leave, and I really didn't want him to do that. If I did, he might leave and take that little object with him, which was something he would not allow to happen. I tried once again to tell him that I wasn't right for the job, that I'd mess it up, and he should just find someone more professional. Now he responded with a pee-wee baseball coach saying stuff like, "Sure you can, kid. You're his roomie. I'm sure he trusts you." And he added that Adam, the name of my roommate there, might even have the object that I was looking for lying around on a coffee table or something. All I needed to do was head down there with a six-pack while the game was on and take a little look around after asking him to use the bathroom. I remember telling the man that Adam wasn't that kind of person, but he only said, "I'm sure you'll think of something, kid. You'll see." And a few minutes later, the guy was dropping me off a block over from my place, saying he'd be in touch the following week. I got out, just feeling numb as I walked back to my place, and then I spent the next few hours wondering what in God's name I was going to do. I tried asking the guy his name before I got out. I tried asking who they were with, too. I got answers to neither, and the guy just said, "It's not important." And then after asking me not to slam his door too hard, he and his boys took off into the night. I didn't even try to memorize the license plate because I believe every word of what he said about the cops. And even if he didn't have anyone on his payroll, they wouldn't be able to protect me from him, not in the short term anyway. And so really, what choice did I have other than to do what that weirdo said? And so I spent the next couple of days fixating on two things. Firstly, I wondered how the heck I was going to get into Adam's place without alerting him. And secondly, I wondered who the hell he was to have landed himself in so much trouble. All I knew was that he was anemic looking, worked in tech, and liked to stay out all night. And then if he was just some nerd, why not snatch him off the street, kind of like they did with me, and then get what they wanted that way? And if it was that important, why not just kick his door down in the middle of the night? Why get me involved? Was Adam dangerous, and if so, how? Those are all of the thoughts that were running through my head over the next week or so, and since I didn't know the first thing about robbery or burglary, I figured my best chance was to sort of fake a break-in. I could make it look like something it wasn't, and if the little labeled object I was looking for didn't move, then maybe he wouldn't take off with it. And I was still toying with that idea the next time I ran into the man in the black sedan. Now, I was walking to my car after work when I spotted his car, and while I'd been just about flinching at anything that looked like it for the past week, this was the real deal. The back door swung open, and I heard that same Bill Burr Boston accent say, "Hey buddy, what do you say we have ourselves a little talk?" I thought about running, but I knew that'd just piss him off, and so I climbed into the back seat with him and we had ourselves that little talk. At first, he asked me how things were going, if I'd made any moves yet, stuff like that, and I was honest with him. I told him I was still in the planning stages, that I was pretty inexperienced with things like that, and that he'd have to give me more time, a lot more time to get it done. And the guy kind of nodded, but added that he didn't have all the time in the world, so I should start making moves now. And that's when the second part happened, the scary part, because when I once again suggested that I wasn't the right guy for the job because I didn't have the moves he was referring to, and I was sure that I'd messed things up, the guy asked me, "So how's Annie doing?" Now the question had the color draining from my face. I literally felt lightheaded when he said it, like a damned bobblehead just trying to keep my head pointed the right way up. My heart started beating faster. I got that cold, sweaty feeling all over again, and try as I might, but I couldn't stop my hands from shaking, because Annie was my grandmother's name. Now, I didn't act like some tough guy. I didn't tell him if you ever lay a finger on her or anything like that. And I was just too stunned to speak, and I stayed too stunned until the guy reassured me that she wasn't in danger. He just wanted to know how she was doing. I didn't answer him. I just told him I'd have the job done by that time next week. And that's when the third portion of our conversation commenced, and he gave me a little advice. He told me to case the place, familiarize myself with it, and to do it soon. The guy then smiled, asked me not to slam his door again, and that marked the end of our second meeting. I thought about what he said, about casing the place, which, for those who don't know, is basically the word criminals use for recon or scouting out or looking around. Getting a look at the place before I actually looked for the thing would give me an idea of where everything was and where I most likely needed to look. And so, as strange as it might sound, I tried the idea I originally dismissed and showed up at Adam's door with a 6-pack of beer, some energy drinks, and 2 boxes of that chef's choice sushi. I figured I could pass the whole thing off as a sort of thanks for being a cool neighbor gift, so even if he didn't drink, I could talk my way inside with that good sushi that I brought. But even so, getting inside was no easy task. When I knocked on his door, Adam obviously didn't seem too excited on letting me inside. A few weeks back, I'd have put that all on him being nothing more than shy, an anxious person maybe, but right then, I knew there was something bigger going on. That didn't stop me from keeping my cool, and I guess that was down to me not having to pretend to be interested in him. I'd been wondering about what he did, how he lived, and what his part of the house looked like for months by that point, and so I didn't have to put on some Oscar-winning performance to make that believable for him. I only really sold the idea of me coming inside by saying I'd basically never ask him again. All I wanted to do was get a feel for my not-so-new roomie, and then I'd leave him in peace like I usually did. He still didn't want to, and that much was obvious, but he knew that accepting my offer meant that I'd leave him alone in the long run, so he invited me inside. Adam's place was spotless. The decor was minimal and monochrome, and he didn't have a television that I could even see, and he had those 2 huge bookcases filled to bursting with all kinds of computer and tech-centric books. And after he put the sushi in his refrigerator, he showed me around a little, not saying all that much, but just trying to be polite, I guess. Now, I started asking about his job, and he said he worked mostly from home, but when I asked to see his setup, he lost what little of the friendliness he had about him and just said no. I tried to play it off like I was just being curious. I wasn't set on and expecting every nook and cranny, even though I was. But then, as I carried on getting vague non-answers to my questions about his job, I was looking around the room and seeing a lot of security cameras. I saw a lot. There were 3 of them set up around the living space and kitchen, all pretty sleek and small ones too. But that was 3 more than I had, and seeing as they made my job that little bit harder, I couldn't help but ask about them. Now, I turned it into a little joke, I suppose, asking if he was just paranoid or I needed that kind of equipment for my own part of the house. Adam just kind of looked at me, like he couldn't think of an explanation, and then murmured something about how it was good to be safe. He didn't seem like a bad guy, you know? I mean, maybe it was just how scared he was, but I couldn't imagine him really doing much harm to anyone or really anything. He was just some computer nerd. One that had done pretty good in life to afford that kind of living arrangement, but a computer nerd nonetheless. And if the mysterious man in the black sedan was sort of like the villain of this story, then maybe Adam was the victim. And if both things were true, then I figured it presented me with the perfect opportunity to make myself the hero. Maybe the phrasing of that makes me sound a little up my own ass or whatever, but I can promise you, fear and the relief of having extracted myself from a difficult situation were also very strong motivators here. I knew that I didn't have it in me to get all Mission Impossible and break in there after deactivating his cameras and hacking his computer and blah 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 Hollywood nonsense. I had to talk to the guy. I mean, really talk to him so we could figure out something together. And it wasn't something I planned before walking into his place. The urge just sort of took me, then and there. And when I asked him again why the cameras were there, and I got another non-answer about security, I asked if the reason he wanted security was because he'd taken something that didn't belong to him. And the second I asked him, the friendliness dropped away again, only that time he looked frightened too. He asked who I was, like who I really was, because I guess he figured I worked for someone. In response, I literally said nobody, absolutely nobody, and I wanted to stay that way too. And then before he had a chance to really panic or anything, I told him exactly what happened with the guy in that black sedan, and how he seemed to know everything, how he was threatening my grandmother, and how he was looking for something that was D-FN or whatever the label was I wrote earlier. Now, I added that all he wanted me to do was report back on where I'd found it, and not to take it. And so whatever it was, he could just leave it someplace, tell me where, and then get the F out of town before the sedan man's goon showed up to collect it, it seemed. I mean, because I was pretty damn sure they'd collect him along with it, and while that'd be rough on my conscience, it'd most likely be even worse for him. Adam agreed, and he actually got kind of emotional as he thanked me for telling him, but I was still very much in the mode of, we need to fix this crap, and now. And so I had to sort of hurry along the buddy-buddy moment and figure out what we were going to do and what was going on. Adam said he needed to copy what was on that drive, as he called it, and he also needed to erase and destroy all the computer stuff he had before leaving. And then including the time he needed to pack some stuff and arrange for some place else to stay, He figured he could be gone in about 12 hours, so 7 o'clock the next morning. And when he left, he'd leave that DF drive that he called it tucked behind the back of a picture frame hanging from a wall in his workspace. And that's where I could tell the guy that I'd found it, and since I couldn't do that until the next time I saw him, Adam would have plenty of time to get far, far away from Seattle. He tried to thank me again, but I wouldn't accept it, because it was now all on him to make sure our little deception wasn't uncovered. He needed to put that drive thing exactly where he'd said it'd be, and he needed to keep the hell away from the entire Pacific Northwest for all I cared. Because if they found out I'd helped him, then we'd both be screwed. Adam promised he'd disappear and that the men threatening my grandma would find what they were looking for, just not the only copy of it. And he only very cryptically reassured me that whatever was on that drive, its release couldn't be traced back to the agreement we'd made. I don't know if that was true or not at the time, but I guess me still breathing is a testament to Adam's honesty. At the time, though, nothing could have fully reassured me. And then after shaking his hand and wishing him luck, I went up to my part of the house, and in the morning, he was gone. I honestly thought dealing with the situation would be like a weight off my shoulders. After all, I'd done what was asked of me and located that little drive, so what else was there to worry about? Well, turns out a whole lot actually, because I still needed the guy in the sedan to buy my story and believe that I hadn't tipped Adam off before he vanished. At times I thought about vanishing myself because if this guy saw through my act, and he was probably going to do just that since he seemed to know everything anyway, then I was screwed. Even if they got the little drive thing they wanted, the guy'd be pissed that I'd lied to him, and big successful criminals don't get that way by being nice and forgiving, do they? Well, a few days go by, and then lo and behold, I finish work one night to see that same black car sitting a few spaces down from my own. The back door opens up as I approach, and then I sit down in the back seat with that smiling jackass sitting next to me. I didn't have to act like I was sick of seeing him, and neither did I need to act nervous about the drive being where Adam said he'd leave it. So, all in all, I guess I was pretty convincing when I said they needed to make their move so that the drive would still be in the place I found it when they did. I remember saying something along the lines of, "I'm not having you guys blame me if he moves it. I did my part already, now leave me the hell alone." And the guy starts laughing that Bill Burr laugh of his heh heh heh, and then told me to calm down and that he'd make their move that night. He said I better go check in a hotel or something, that I should concoct a story about meeting up with a girl or something to that effect if anyone asks, because when the cops got involved, it'd be easier for me to just say I didn't see anything because I wasn't there. And the last thing I said, and I figured this would be the last thing I ever said to the guy, was, "What about my money?" Now, don't think I was dumb enough to expect to get paid. I'm not that naive when it comes to the criminal underworld, but I also figured not asking would maybe raise suspicion somehow, so I did. Now, I'm sure this won't come as a surprise to any of you with fully functioning brains, but when I asked to be paid, the guy just laughed that heh 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 laugh of his and asked me why he'd pay me for something I just did for free. I took the guy's advice. I didn't want to make him think that I had a whole parallel plan going on, so I got the hotel room. And the next morning, when I made my way back to my car and drove home, one of the front doors had been smashed open, and Adam's apartment had been broken into as well. I called the cops, acted totally ignorant of everything, and just like the guy said, I was able to sort of say I didn't see anything because I was in a hotel with a girl that I met at work. And a uniformed cop later asked me why I hadn't brought the girl back to my place, but he seemed satisfied when I looked very sheepish and told him that we didn't want her husband finding out. And he gave me one hell of a judgmental look, but he didn't question anything further. I then had the landlord call me to ask me what the hell was going on, and she stopped by that same afternoon to take a look around. She seemed relieved that Adam's place was the only one targeted and that neither of us had been home when whoever it was broke in. After that, I thought that was pretty much it, that I'd somehow navigated dealing with some big-shot gangster without getting anyone hurt, and given enough time, the info or whatever that Adam got away with might get around to biting big fat Bill Burr on his freaking fat ass. But then came the night he and his boys showed up outside work again, in their big black sedan with its tinted windows. I didn't have to act or play pretend when I responded, I thought we were done. What else do you want from me?" But that time, Big Bill Burr didn't play pretend either. He didn't say, "Oh hey buddy, how's it going?" like he normally did. He just leaned out a little and then growled at me to get in the car before he had his guy drag me in. Now I knew that was the last time, I didn't, but that's what I told myself as I headed for the car. Just one more time and then this whole goddamn nightmare is over. I thought it'd be the easiest one, with all the hard stuff having been and gone, and I even figured that the guy might even see it good to pay me now that he'd gotten what he'd wanted. But that's not what happened. After I climbed into the back, and one of Fat Bill Burr's goons closed the door behind me, I tried to basically go on the offensive. Any kind of nervousness, and I might as well just write "I tipped him off" on my forehead with a Sharpie. But even after saying, "What do you want now, dude? You said we were done," he completely shut me down by saying, "I know what you did." I had to keep going. I couldn't just quit right there and then, and so I pushed back saying, "Yeah, you do. I risked going to jail for you, maybe even got myself shot. But here you are, still bothering me." I didn't get past the "here you are" part before they cut me off again. Told me the only reason I was still alive was because he couldn't prove that I tipped off my roommate. He admitted to getting his hands on that drive, the one with a DF code on it. But as I suspected, he wanted his hands on Adam too, and he was angry that he slipped through his fingers. He asked me straight up if I'd tipped Adam off, and when I said no, he just rolled his eyes and called me a lying sack of crap. He then told me that for my information I should know that a body washed up on Alki Beach that very morning, and the cops thought it was my roommate, Adam. But Fat Bill Burr knew it wasn't. He said the reason the cops were so convinced it was Adam was because the body that they found had Adam's teeth. But it wasn't Adam, and Fat Bill Burr wanted me to know that the blood of that random homeless dude was on my hands and not his. And that was the only time I couldn't hold up my act anymore, and Bill Burr saw it. He then says, "Oh, you didn't think about that part, did you, kid? You didn't really take the time to find out who your little roommate was, huh?" I think I must have stammered or made some gesture because he seemed to know what I was going to say and anticipated it with, "You didn't need to know, so we didn't tell you. And even if you didn't tell him anything, you had one job to do, kid, and you messed it up." I remember telling the most unconvincing lie ever, saying I swear I didn't tell him. But all that guy said in response was, "Get out of my car," before reminding me once again not to slam his door. And that was the last I saw of Fat Bill Burr. I wasn't sure, and I'm still not 100% sure if this guy just sort of made all that stuff up as a way of making me feel guilty. Killing me was just more trouble, and I guess so was beating the crap out of me and giving me a real reason to go to the cops. But planning something like that in my head, a lie that I couldn't never really confirm or disprove, I think that was supposed to be his parting shot. I'm happy to say that it didn't hit the target, not after a while anyway. I did a whole bunch of digging online and not a single body has been brought in from Alki all year, and the last being maybe 18 months previous to this. So Fat Bill Burr just had to have been lying, I think. Adam wasn't a bad guy. He might have done something dumb to have the mob on his ass like that, but I feel pretty confident that I'd done the right thing in warning him. I still feel that way, and I feel like I managed to navigate my ship through some very stormy waters, and somehow I managed to thread the needle in a way that saved both mine and Adam's asses. I feel pretty proud of myself sometimes, and it reminds me that taking the hard road and doing the right thing even when it's tough and scary is always the right way to go. But if I go the rest of my life never having to make tough choices like that again, I'll be a very happy man, and wherever Adam is these days, I hope he's okay, and that him and that Fat Bill Burr will never cross paths again. My name's Ryan, and I'm a grad student here in NYC, and I just managed to escape from the worst roommate I've ever had. I've been a fan of the show for a while now, and I've always kind of hoped that I'd never have a reason to contribute. I thought I could just listen to everyone else's creepy stories and never experience one of my own, but I guess that all changed when I met Kurt. I won't bore you with all the ins and outs of my housing situation in September last year, but let's just say that I needed a place to stay, and I needed it badly. And so I ended up going to view a single room in a shared apartment where my roomie would be a guy called Kurt. And Kurt wasn't there during the viewing, and I'm guessing that not only was that on purpose, but the landlord had the place scrubbed down to make it look like a regular, sane person lived there. After some couch surfing, I moved in on a 6-month contract starting October 1st of last year, and when I first met Kurt, I had absolutely no measure of what a creep he was going to be. He seemed like a quiet guy, into his old-school heavy metal with his long red hair and beard, and I honestly figured the only issue might be loud music or something like that. But pretty quickly, Kurt showed his character. And the first thing, and probably the least creepy thing relative to everything else, was his music. He played bass guitar, and at first me and him were pretty cool, so I asked him what band he was into after hearing him play one day. Now, he was into much more extreme stuff, but we talked about bands like Sabbath, Zeppelin, and my personal favorite, AC/DC, for a while, and it was cool to find some shared interests. But then, Kurt asked if I wanted to listen to something he wrote. Now, I responded saying, sure, go ahead, and then he gets out his phone and starts playing this recording that's just his bass line and a drum track. It sounded pretty cool at first, like kind of creepy sounding, but still pretty good, and it kind of reminded me of Dawn Patrol by Megadeth, if you know the song. Some vocals kicked in, something kind of weird sounding I had to almost concentrate on to hear, but then I realized I wasn't hearing anyone singing. It sounded like a young woman talking, and she sounded very upset. I figured it was some kind of spoken word thing that he was working on with someone, but then, as the girl kept on talking, I realized that she was the survivor of a violent, carnal assault, and that she was recounting her experiences either in court or some kind of police tape. I said, dude, is it real? And not like a sort of, oh man, that's cool kind of way, like, what the F kind of way. But Kurt just smiled and nodded and then started telling me about the exact crime it was from and things like that. I didn't say it to his face, but I thought using that audio was in very, very poor taste. But like I said, I didn't want to start an argument or cause any tension, and so I just palmed him off with something like, good art is always provocative, I guess, and then turned our talk onto something else. I only had to live with the guy, and I didn't think his weird taste in tunes meant that he was a serial killer or anything like that, but then I guess in that department, the thing he did next did him no favors. So I come home, I'm hungry, I open the fridge, and there's a bunch of what looks like organ meats in unlabeled jars, and the whole fridge stinks like vinegar. I felt like his stepdad or something going up to his room and asking him, like, hey buddy, what's that you left in the refrigerator there? It's awfully stinky for shared food storage, don't you think? Now Kurt's just sitting there, blasted out of his skull and listening to the Melvins, and while yes, the Melvins rule, they don't pair well with pickled organ meats. Kurt apologized, told me they were sort of not-so-live models for an art project that he was working on, and said that he'd have them out of the fridge by the end of the week. Again, this wasn't so bad because while it wasn't nice looking at a shriveled-up pig's heart every time I grabbed some creamer, it wasn't affecting my quality of life or anything like that. But then, come the end of the week, the way Kurt chose to dispose of those organs pushed things to a whole other level. I woke up to take a leak at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I had to be up at 6:30, so I'm pissed that I'm actually losing out on sleep. I hit the upstairs hallway in my boxers, breathing through my nose, all half asleep, and then, bam, this smell like sour death just punches me in the nose. I can hear frying coming from downstairs, and so I kind of knew what Kurt was doing before I saw it. But I went down anyway to make sure, and when I saw him frying those pickled organs in a goddamn pan, I said, dude, what the actual F are you doing right now? Again, Kurt was all apologies like he always was. I promise that's not a Nirvana reference, but that time I was actually pissed off. Because once I went back up to bed, all I could smell was that sour death smell after it had gotten into my room. I couldn't go back to sleep at all. Like half because of the smell and half because of how mad I was that he'd try and cook that crap at 4 in the goddamn morning. It made him sick too, like he pretty much occupied the bathroom for the next 48 hours, meaning that I was relegated to peeing in bottles whenever he was camped out in there or whenever I was too scared to witness the aftermath. And that kind of knocked the pep out of him for a while, I suppose, because there was no more weird behavior out of Kurt, at least none I could see. Now, the next thing happened maybe 2 or 3 weeks later when I came home to find a piece of meat hanging from some string he had tied to a cabinet handle, just sort of hanging there over the workspace. It didn't have a hook going through it like you might be imagining. It was sort of all wrapped up and tied in a string, but then the string had little tiny pieces of metal hooked on them, and so the meat looked like it had maybe 4 or 5 of these little metal tags on it. Each tag had weird little symbols on it that was different to the others. Now right away I'm thinking, Kurt, what the hell, man? And while I wanted to just toss it because it was a freaking dripping onto the counter, I just wrapped it up in plastic and put it in the fridge for him. Kurt comes home asking why I moved his meat, and then asked me not to do it again because he was curing it. I asked him if he put any salt on it, like fully knowing that he didn't because I saw it, and when he said no, I said he needed to put a lot of salt on it if he wanted to cure it. Now he says, "Oh, okay, thanks." And then when I visit the kitchen, there it is again. No salt, no rub, no nothing. It's just there. I looked up how to cure meat, and what I read says you actually do gotta put it in the fridge while it's salted, and so at that point I'm thinking, okay, why the hell is he lying to me? I didn't want to argue with him. I like the quiet life, you know? And so instead of actually telling him what a disgusting creep he was being with his little hellraiser ornament, I very politely suggested that he keep his meat in his bedroom so he wasn't making the kitchen unsanitary. I also added that he was going to make it a safety issue. I had no choice but to contact the landlord. I wasn't a dick about it. It was more like, just work with me, dude. And since he wasn't a total a-hole, Kurt agreed to do just that and keep his meat in his room. The final straw was when the smell of rotten meat started seeping out from under his bedroom door. And then it wasn't long before I noticed an uptick of flies in our apartment. I got in touch with the landlord and asked him to perform some kind of apartment inspection so he could personally tell Kurt to stop just letting raw meat rot in his bedroom. He said he was busy for a couple of days and he would be over the first chance he got. But before then, I realized why the apartment was starting to smell worse and worse. It wasn't just seeping out from Kurt's door. He was hiding pieces of it around the apartment and letting it rot. He didn't get violent or yell at me when I confronted him about it. He gave me some evil-looking death stare, but he didn't say anything. He just slammed his bedroom door in my face, told me he didn't want to talk to me anymore, and at that I called the landlord again and told him not to bother coming over, or at least not on my behalf anyways, because I wanted out. I still had to pay him a month's rent at the start of this month, but I honestly thought it was worth it just to get away from Kurt in that apartment. I think he's a scumbag because I figured that he deliberately hid Kurt's character from me, who, by the way, was having his rent paid by his goddamn parents. I also used to wonder how he could afford to live there without any discernible source of income, but on the way out, the landlord mentioned it and it all suddenly made sense. The same landlord actually offered me an alternative place to stay, but there was no way in hell that I was about to trust him again. Not after he basically tricked me into living with a freak like Kurt. So let me tell you a story about how the best living situation I ever had turned into the worst living situation I ever had, and why there's never been a truer statement than never judge a book by its cover. So many moons ago now, I was looking for places to live in the city I'm at when I came across this pretty amazing apartment while going through the listings. The decor is awesome, it's all furnished, and it was maybe 15 minutes walk away from my job too, so literally perfect in almost every possible way. The only drawback was that it was a shared apartment. Now, I wasn't completely averse to living with someone, but I also knew that if there was a clash of personalities or something like that, then things could get pretty tense pretty quick. I'd previously lived with a guy, I'm a guy myself by the way, who could only be safely described on YouTube as a Neolithic savage, because if I go into any detail I'll probably get this video flagged if you actually read it. Now my point is, I knew that there was no point in me living in that place if the roomie was going to be difficult, and so I asked the landlord if I could meet him during the viewing, and that is how I met Todd. And Todd seemed like the dream roommate, honestly. He said he worked a lot and that he liked going to the gym and all of that in his spare time, but when he said that he'd be out of the apartment a lot, he wasn't kidding. I had the whole place to myself pretty much all day, every day, and the only times that I'd catch him chilling on the couch was when the game was on or when he had an injury or something like that. But even when he was home, I was stoked to have him around. He was a funny guy, he was clean, and he was chill too, so generally nice and easy to live with. But then came the night when everything changed. So the place had these 2 big bedrooms, these ensuite bathrooms, the works. Mine had a lock on the door too, but I didn't think that I'd need it, you know? Todd was a respectful and mature enough person to knock before entering and whatnot, so while I briefly considered using the lock, in the end I was sort of thinking, why bother? Now anyways, I've been living there for just over a month with absolutely 0 complaints all around, and the whole time, Todd was the ideal roomie. But then one night, I woke up needing to pee in the middle of the night like usual, and when I rolled over in bed, all I could see was this dark figure standing by the open doorway. And I freaking screamed so loud. I pretty much dived backwards off the bed, still screaming at the top of my lungs. Then by the time I grabbed the little folding knife I kept in the drawer, Todd had switched on the light. It was him, standing there in his underwear, but as weird as it might sound, he was just as surprised as I was. You see, Todd wasn't aware that he'd got up out of bed and walked into my bedroom because he'd been sleepwalking. Now, I said he probably should have just told me that once I'd moved in, but as it turned out, Todd hadn't done any sleepwalking for years. He said he used to do it a bunch when he was a kid, especially after he and his family moved house one time, and he figured it was probably the change of me moving in having triggered it or something, and said that he'd never had neglected to mention if he'd been actively sleepwalking. I just wanted to get to sleep, honestly, so I just told him everything was fine and then went back to bed. Now, the next morning, I texted him to say basically, hey, sorry if that was weird, and I'm sorry about your condition coming back. I hope everything's okay. He told me we were good, but that maybe I should start locking my door in the future. I texted him back saying, sure thing, Captain Obvious, with maybe a laughing emoji, and then we were pals again. Now from then on, I started locking my door at night, but it also wasn't like Todd wasn't doing anything about it. He said he went to some doctor who gave him a prescription for mild sleeping pills, and then for about a week or so there was nothing. And then one night, I'm asleep in bed and I hear bang, 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 bang on my bedroom door. Now once again, I'm just about jumping out of bed, but since Todd's knocking, I figured that he must be awake, so I asked him what's up. But I get zero response. I knew he must have been sleepwalking, so I called out to him to say, hey, wake up! All that kind of stuff, but again, I got no reply. I got up out of bed thinking, please don't make this a regular thing. And then when I opened up the door, there's Todd, buck naked, with his eyes all rolled up in their sockets so all I could see was the whites. I yelled something, slammed the door, and I think that's what woke him up, because the next thing I hear is him saying sorry and then running back to his room, still apologizing. I didn't follow him. I was mad, but what the hell could I do? The guy had some serious condition. It wasn't really his fault. And so I went back to sleep, went to work the next morning, and then called Todd at lunch to see how he was doing. He kept apologizing for waking me up, but I made it clear that as long as he was seeking help, then it was fine, because sooner or later the issue would be resolved, and that's aside from the fact that he couldn't really help it. He was super grateful, which was fine, because what choice did I have other than to work with him? And then again, that same sort of pattern played itself out. He went to the doctor, got more powerful sleeping pills, and even started hammering cardio at the gym after work to really tire himself out, you know? And there were another couple of weeks without incidents, and then once again, I woke up to Todd banging on my door in the middle of the night. I was just getting so tired of it by then. Almost every time we thought he'd handled it, it came back all over again. I started to suspect that he might not be sleepwalking, and that this was sort of like a weird way of trying to force me out. But I guess that was my paranoia and exhaustion talking because, well, I guess you'll soon see. And so he bangs on my door, wakes me up, and I start telling him to wake up and go back to bed. I put my head back down on the pillow, and he didn't knock again, but I also didn't hear him wake up or walk back to his room, so I got up, walked to the door, and started listening out for him. I figured that he might have maybe quickly walked off to another part of the house, but I also didn't want to just open my door up just in case he was standing there naked again. And so as I said, I listened, and what I heard sent a chill run through me. Todd was standing on the other side of the door all right, and I knew that because he was whispering something. I knew it was just his unconscious brain working and that what he was saying probably didn't mean a thing, but just hearing him whispering on the other side of the door gave me the creeps, big time. I ended up waking him up by banging on the door back at him, and it sucked to hear him get scared and frightened, but at least it let me know that he was for real. I started questioning why him knocking on my door didn't wake him up, but me knocking back at him did. But I guess it was sort of like the outside stimulus throwing him off his sleep rhythm or something, because, like I said, I don't suspect him of faking this anymore. Now anyway, the final time it happened, before I started to consider just leaving at the end of that month, I recorded it to show Todd that next morning, and I guess just so he could see things from my perspective. Now he started hammering on my door again, and I tried waking him up by banging back, but for some reason that didn't work, and he started whispering again. Now I banged a second time, thinking another round of knocking back might do the trick, but all that did was make Todd start speaking louder, and it was then that I heard what he was saying for the first time, and it was almost like a prayer, but all kinds of jumbled. There was a lot of, "Our Heavenly Father, Lord, hallowed be thy name," but none of it actually went anywhere. It was all these phrases just sort of looping and spiraling until it sounded almost like nonsense talk, just like an edge of reason to it. Now he spoke in this weird voice too, like in the back of his throat almost, and I honestly think that it was one of the single creepiest things I've ever heard in my life. If I just woke up to that on the first night it happened, then I'd have been even more spooked than when Todd just appeared in my room. But since I kind of knew what was happening, I just went back to bed with a pillow wrapped around my head and tried to get some sleep. Now the next morning before I left for work, I showed him the video I took the previous night. It obviously didn't show much of him, but it captured all the creepy sounding nonsensical prayers that he recited in the back of his throat voice of his. I massively regret showing him that video, and I didn't do it to be mean or anything like that. I just needed him to see how serious it was and how bad he was disturbing my sleep. But oh man, the second he heard himself, it was like the stuffing had been knocked out of him. He went quiet. He said sorry, and then after telling him I'd see him later and we could talk about it after work, I figured that he'd head out the door like he usually did. Only he didn't. He just sat down at the kitchen table and he started to cry. Now later that day I got a text from Todd saying that he was checking himself into some kind of medical facility and that he might not be back for a month or two, maybe more.